when the Pantheon of Olympus still held dominion over the mortal world, long before a ghost of Sparta would paint their marble halls crimson with divine blood, the cosmos witnessed a war so catastrophic that reality itself bears the scars to this day. The Titanomachy, as scholars would later name it with trembling hands, was not merely a conflict between gods and their predecessors. It was existence tearing itself apart, a 10-year apocalypse where mountains became weapons, oceans boiled into steam, and millions of mortals were erased from reality as casually as one might brush dust from their shoulder. Picture this: Zeus, not yet the tyrant king that Kratos would one day destroy, standing atop a shattered mountain peak, his master bolt crackling with power that could unmake stars. Across from him, Kronos, the titan of time, wielding the same adamantine scythe that had once castrated the primordial sky itself. Between them, the air splits and reality bleeds, as two forces that should never have existed simultaneously prepare to determine whether the future belongs to the old gods or the new. But here is what the ancient texts dare not record, what the surviving Olympians spent millennia trying to hide. Zeus's victory was not earned through strength or courage or divine righteousness. It was purchased with betrayal so absolute, so fundamentally cruel, that it would curse every drop of divine blood for eternity. The very corruption that would later drive Kratos to systematically slaughter the Olympic pantheon was born not from power's slow decay, but from a single moment during the Titanomachy, when Zeus looked at those who had helped him win and decided that gratitude was a weakness he could not afford. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming if you know where to look. The Mediterranean Sea itself, that vast body of water separating continents, was once solid land until a titan's death throes cracked the earth so deeply that oceans rushed in to fill the wound. The Greek islands scattered across those waters, each one is a piece of a titan's body, transformed to stone in their final moments and left as eternal monuments to divine brutality. Mount Olympus bears scars that predate any mortal civilization, claw marks the size of valleys where desperate titans tried to climb to safety before being cast into the abyss. Consider the scale of what transpired. 12 titans, beings who had ruled creation since the cosmos took shape, each one commanding fundamental aspects of reality. Oceanus controlled every drop of water that existed. Hyperion's gaze could pierce through time and space. Atlas possessed strength enough to support the entire celestial sphere, and Kronos, their king, could age anything to dust or reverse its existence entirely. These were not merely powerful beings, they were the architecture of reality itself, and their children sought to tear them down and rebuild existence in their own image. The prophecy that initiated this cosmic patricide came from the oracle at Dodona, though the oracle itself would not exist for mortals until millennia later. It spoke in languages that predated speech, communicating through the arrangement of stars and the patterns of falling leaves. The message was simple and absolute. Kronos would fall to his children just as he had overthrown his own father, Uranos. What the prophecy failed to mention was the price of that victory. It did not speak of the 100-handed monsters that would be unleashed from the deepest pits of Tartarus. It did not warn of the 3 Cyclopes whose forge would create weapons capable of killing immortals, and it certainly did not reveal that Zeus's methods would make his father's cruelties seem like mercy in comparison. Yet even these horrors pale before the war's true legacy, every act of divine cruelty that would later drive mortals to curse the gods, every petty Olympic squabble that would cost thousands of human lives, every moment of Zeus's paranoid tyranny that would eventually create a monster named Kratos, all of it stems from those 10 years when the cosmos ran red with Ichor. The Olympians did not simply defeat the Titans, they became them, inheriting not just their power, but their corruption, their paranoia, and their inevitable doom. In the beginning, before time had meaning, before space had dimension, there was only chaos. Not chaos as mortals understand it, not mere disorder or confusion, but chaos as a living void, a conscious emptiness that hungered to be filled. From this primordial nothingness emerged the first tangible being, Gaia, the Earth Mother, her body forming the foundation upon which all existence would be built. She was alone in the darkness for eons beyond counting, until loneliness itself became so unbearable that she willed into being her equal and opposite, Kronos, the sky. Their union was both creation and catastrophe. When earth and sky embraced, their passion literally gave birth to new forms of existence. First came the 12 Titans, beings of such magnificent power that their very thoughts could reshape reality. Oceanus emerged first, his body immediately becoming all the waters that would ever exist, flowing around his mother Gaia in an endless embrace. Then came Hyperion, whose eyes opened to create the concept of light itself, bringing the first illumination to the cosmos. Themis followed, and with her birth came the idea of divine law and justice, concepts that had never before existed but would now govern all divine interactions. Each Titan's birth added new layers to reality. When Mnemosyne emerged, memory became possible, allowing events to have meaning beyond their immediate moment. Tethys brought forth the concept of nurturing, making growth and healing possible. Theia's arrival created the ability to see beauty and value in things, transforming mere existence into something worth preserving. Phoebe introduced prophecy and mystery, allowing the future to cast shadows backward through time. Crius gave form to the constellations, creating navigation and destiny written in stars. Rhea embodied the flow of time and generations, making succession and inheritance possible. But the final 2 Titans would prove the most significant. Atlas emerged with strength, so absolute that he could bear any burden, lift any weight, endure any trial. His muscles were not mere flesh, but concentrated force itself, the physical manifestation of persistence and power. And lastly came Kronos, the youngest but destined to be the strongest, born with an adamantine scythe already in his hand, and ambition burning in his eyes like newborn stars. Time itself bent around him, acknowledging its new master. Yet Kronos looked upon his children with disgust rather than pride. The Titans were too powerful, too independent, too capable of threatening his dominion over the sky. But worse were the other children that followed. The Cyclops came next, each with a single eye that could see through deception and forge weapons from pure thought. Brontes commanded thunder, Steropes controlled lightning, and Arges mastered the forge of heavenly fire. Kronos saw in their singular vision a focus that could challenge his scattered attention, a dedication that could overcome his vastness. Then came the beings that finally broke Kronos' tolerance. The Hecatonchires, the hundred-handed ones, Kratos, Briareus, and Gigas, were so horrific in appearance, so overwhelming in their potential for violence, that even looking upon them caused lesser beings to go mad. Each possessed 50 heads that could speak different languages simultaneously, think different thoughts, see in different spectrums of reality. Their 100 arms could wage 100 wars at once, throw 100 mountains in a single moment, strangle 100 enemies simultaneously. They were violence incarnate, war given form before war as a concept even existed. Kronos' response was immediate and absolute. He seized the Cyclops first, dragging them to the edge of existence where Gaia's body met the void. There he tore open a wound in reality itself, creating Tartarus, a prison so deep that an anvil would fall for 9 days before reaching its floor. He cast the Cyclops into this abyss, sealing them with chains forged from his own essence, ensuring they could never escape without his will. The Hecatonchires followed, thrown even deeper to a place where darkness had weight and silence screamed. But Kronos' cruelty did not end with imprisonment. When Gaia's womb quickened with new life, more monsters and giants growing within her, Uranos forced them to remain unborn. He would press down upon her with the full weight of the sky, crushing any attempt at birth, forcing Gaia to contain children that grew ever larger, ever angrier within her. The Earth Mother's body became a prison for her own offspring, her screams of agony echoing through dimensions that mortals would never perceive. Gaia's pain transformed into rage, and rage into determination. In secret, using ore from her own bones and hatred as a forge, she created a weapon unlike any that had existed before. An adamantine scythe that could cut through anything, even the bonds between concepts, even the line between existence and void. The blade was impossibly sharp, its edge existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, capable of severing not just flesh but the very idea of connection. She gathered her 12 Titan children in secret when Uranos slept, and his vigilance wavered. In the darkness beneath the earth, where even the sky's gaze could not penetrate, she presented the scythe and made her plea. She needed one of them, just one, to take the weapon and use it against their father, to cut away his tyranny and free their imprisoned siblings. Oceanus, the eldest, recoiled from the suggestion, his waters running cold at the thought of attacking the primordial sky. Hyperion's light dimmed as he considered the cosmic implications. One by one, each Titan found reasons to refuse, understanding that to attack Uranos was to attack the very order of existence. All except Kronos. The youngest Titan stepped forward, his hand closing around the scythe's handle with disturbing eagerness. But as his fingers wrapped around the weapon, Gaia saw something in her youngest son's eyes that gave even her pause. It was not righteousness or love for his imprisoned siblings that motivated him. It was not even hatred for his father's tyranny. It was pure, undiluted ambition, a hunger for power that exceeded even Uranos's need for control. In that moment, Gaia understood that she was not freeing the cosmos from one tyrant, but potentially creating another. Yet her pain was too great, her rage too consuming to stop. The plan was set in motion. Uranos, despite his cruelty, still desired Gaia, still came to her in the darkness to continue their primal union. 4 of Kronos' brothers would hold their father down at the corners of the earth: Hyperion, Cryos, Iapetus, and Cous, each grasping one of the sky's limbs and pulling with all their might to keep him vulnerable. And Kronos, hidden in shadow with the adamantine scythe, would strike. The night arrived heavy with fate. Uranos descended as he always did, confident in his dominion, blinded by his arrogance to the danger awaiting him. As he pressed down upon Gaia, 4 pairs of Titan hands erupted from the earth, seizing his ethereal form and pulling it into physical vulnerability. Uranos's roar of surprise shook stars from their positions, but before he could react, Kronos emerged from hiding. The castration of Uranos was not swift. The adamantine scythe cut through layers of reality, each stroke severing connections between sky and earth, between past and future, between what was and what would be. Uranos's screams created the first thunderstorms, his thrashing carved the first mountain ranges, his Ichor falling to earth spawned the Furies, the Giants, and the Meliae. The severed genitals were cast into the sea, their foam birthing Aphrodite, beauty born from violence, love emerging from betrayal. As Uranos retreated to the highest reaches of the sky, forever separated from the earth, he spoke his curse with what remained of his power. His words carved themselves into the fabric of destiny itself, becoming less prediction than cosmic law. Kronos too would be overthrown by his children, just as he had overthrown his father. The cycle of patricide would continue, each generation destroying the one before, until existence itself collapsed under the weight of accumulated betrayals. Kronos stood victorious, the blood of primordial sky still dripping from his scythe. But the curse had already taken root. In his moment of triumph, paranoia was born. Every shadow could hide a future usurper. Every child would be a potential enemy. The golden age of the Titans would begin, but it would be built on a foundation of fear that would crack and crumble, setting the stage for a war that would make Uranos's castration seem like a gentle mercy compared to what was coming. The golden age that followed Uranos's fall was magnificent in its deception. For 1,000 years, perhaps more, the Titans ruled with what appeared to be benevolence. Mortals, newly emerged from Gaia's flesh like flowers from soil, lived without knowledge of suffering. They ate fruit that grew without cultivation, drank from streams that ran clear without source, and died peacefully in their sleep only to be reborn at dawn. Disease was a concept that had not been invented. War was a word that had no meaning. Under Kronos's rule, time moved in perfect circles, each day identical to the last, each season flowing seamlessly into the next. But paradise is often prison viewed from the wrong angle. The mortals who lived in this golden age had no ambition because achievement was impossible when everything was provided. They had no love because loss did not exist to give affection meaning. They created no art because struggle had not yet taught them beauty. They were happy in the way a dreamless sleep is peaceful, existing without truly living. Kronos himself sat upon a throne carved from a single piece of time, crystallized into obsidian, so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His brothers and sisters had divided the cosmos among themselves. Oceanus encircled the world in an endless river, his wife Tethys birthing 3,000 rivers and 3,000 ocean nymphs to populate the waters. Hyperion had taken residence in the eastern sky, commanding the sun's path with his children Helios, Selene, and Eos. Themis established the first laws, though in a world without crime, her edicts were more philosophy than prohibition. Yet beneath this perfection, Kronos rotted from within. The curse of Uranos had not been an idle threat, but a poison that worked slowly, invisibly, inevitably. Every night, Kronos would wake screaming from dreams, where shadowy figures tore him from his throne. Every celebration became a potential ambush. Every congratulation sounded like mockery. His own reflection began to look like an enemy waiting for weakness. The prophecy came, as prophecies always do in Greek mythology, sideways and shrouded. Through the very titaness of prophecy herself, Phoebe. She had inherited the oracle at Delphi, though Delphi as mortals would know it, did not yet exist. Instead, she dwelt in a cave where the earth released vapors that showed visions of what must be. One night, as Kronos consulted her about threats to his reign, she spoke words that would reshape existence itself. "A child of your blood shall rise with thunder in his fist," she whispered, her voice layered with the echoes of future centuries. "Born of deception, raised in shadow, he will feast on rage and emerge from hiding to cast down the Lord of Time himself. The golden throne will crack, the pillars of reality will shake, and a new order will rise from the ashes of the old." Kronos's response was immediate and horrific in its simplicity. He would have no children, but the Fates, those three sisters who existed outside even Titan law, had already woven the thread. Rhea, his sister, and now his wife, was pregnant with their first child. The baby grew within her womb, despite Kronos's demands for abortion, through divine means. No herb could poison a god within a goddess. No magic could unmake what destiny had ordained. When Hestia was born, glowing with the warm light of the hearth she would someday represent, Kronos looked upon his daughter for exactly one moment. In that instant, he saw not an infant, but a warrior goddess standing over his broken body. Without hesitation, without even allowing Rhea to name the child, Kronos unhinged his jaw like a serpent and swallowed Hestia whole. She disappeared down his throat, still glowing, and the light in the throne room dimmed forever. Rhea's screams could be heard across all creation. Mountains wept avalanches in sympathy. Oceans pulled back from shores in horror. But Kronos felt only relief. The prophecy could not be fulfilled if the child never grew. What he failed to understand was that gods do not die from being swallowed. They do not even stop growing. Inside his stomach, Hestia continued to exist, continued to age, continued to burn with a fury that would one day help consume his reign. 5 more times, Rhea would give birth. 5 more times, Kronos would swallow his offspring. Demeter came next, already crowned with grain that would never grow. Then Hera, born with a queen's bearing and rage that could crack marble. Hades emerged in silence, shadows clinging to him like a second skin. Poseidon arrived amid a spontaneous flood, water pouring from nowhere, as if the universe itself wept for him. Each child disappeared down their father's throat. Each continued to grow in the prison of his stomach, their divine essence unable to be digested or destroyed. By the time Rhea became pregnant for the 6th time, madness had worn grooves in her mind like water-carving canyons. She could feel her children moving inside Kronos during their conjugal visits, could hear their muffled cries when he laughed, could sense their growing hatred radiating from his belly like heat from a forge. The other Titans watched in horror, but did nothing. Who could challenge the Lord of Time? Who would risk being unmade, aged to dust, or worse, frozen in a single moment of agony for eternity? But Rhea had learned cunning from her suffering. When her 6th pregnancy began to show, she hid it beneath flowing robes and divine illusions. She complained of illness to avoid Kronos's bed, claimed religious obligations to absent herself from court. Most importantly, she sought help from the one being Kronos could never digest or destroy, her mother, Gaia. The Earth Mother had watched her son become the very monster he had helped her destroy. The cycle she had initiated was spinning faster than anticipated, growing more vicious with each revolution. When Rhea came to her weeping tears that carved valleys, Gaia made a decision that would echo through mythology. She would hide this final child, raise him in secret, train him to be the weapon that would break the cycle or die trying. The cave on Mount Ida in Crete was more than a hiding place. It was a pocket outside of time's flow, a blind spot in Kronos's omniscient gaze. When Zeus was born during a thunderstorm that Rhea had to muffle with her own screams, when lightning crowned his infant head and eagles circled, despite being nowhere near the cave, Gaia knew this child was different. He did not cry like an infant. He roared like a force of nature. The deception required to hide Zeus was elaborate beyond mortal comprehension. Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes, a stone Gaia had carved to perfectly mimic an infant's weight and warmth. She doused it in ambrosia to give it the scent of divinity. Most brilliantly, she hexed it to move slightly, to gurgle occasionally, to seem alive just long enough for Kronos to swallow it without suspicion. The presentation was performed with theatrical perfection. Rhea arrived at court wailing, clutching the bundle, begging Kronos to spare just this one child. Her performance was so convincing that even Oceanus moved to intervene. But Kronos, lost completely to paranoia, snatched the bundle from her arms and swallowed it in one practiced motion. The stone settled in his stomach alongside his 5 divine children, and he believed himself safe. Meanwhile, in Crete, Zeus grew at a rate that defied even divine normal. The nymphs who raised him, Amalthea and Melissa, fed him honey that dripped from trees that had never known flowers, and milk from a goat whose horns would later become the cornucopia, the Corites. Ancient warriors who existed before war was invented, danced and clashed their spears against shields whenever baby Zeus cried, the noise drowning out any sound that might reach Kronos' ears. But Zeus was not raised merely to hide. He was raised to war. Metis, the Oceanad of wisdom and cunning, came to him in secret to teach him strategy. She showed him how to turn enemy strength into weakness, how to make allies of enemies, how to win wars before the first spear was thrown. The infant god absorbed these lessons with frightening ease, his mind expanding to encompass concepts of power and manipulation that would define his entire reign. By the time Zeus reached what mortals would call adolescence, though he was barely a decade old, he had grown into something unprecedented. He was not merely powerful like Atlas or cunning like Prometheus. He was both and more. When he spoke, thunder rolled behind his words. When he moved, the air itself parted in respect. When he smiled, which was rare, even immortals felt compelled to smile back. But when he frowned, clouds gathered from clear skies. The young god's education included horrible truths. Gaia showed him visions of his siblings trapped in their father's stomach, slowly going mad from isolation and digestive acid that could never quite dissolve them. She told him of the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires still imprisoned in Tartarus, potential allies of unimaginable power. Most importantly, she taught him that raw strength had not defeated Kronos. Cunning, preparation, and willingness to do whatever was necessary had won that primordial battle. Zeus began to form his plan. It would not be enough to simply challenge Kronos. The Titan Lord controlled time itself, could age his enemies to dust or reverse them to pre-existence. A direct assault would fail before it began. No, Zeus would need to be smarter, crueler, more willing to break divine law than even his grandfather had been. He would need allies, weapons, and most importantly, he would need his siblings. Metis provided the solution, a potion brewed from herbs that grew only in places where reality was thin, where the digestive systems of even titans could be disrupted. The mixture was colorless, odorless, tasteless, yet it would cause the most violent regurgitation in cosmic history. But getting it into Kronos would require Zeus to enter the Titan court, to stand before the father who had swallowed him, to serve him wine without being recognized and destroyed. The disguise was perfect, because it was partial truth. Zeus presented himself as a young cupbearer from a distant region, talented and ambitious, seeking to serve the great Lord of Time. His apparent mortality was a masterwork of deception, divine power compressed and hidden so thoroughly that even Hyperion's all-seeing gaze detected nothing unusual. Kronos, arrogant in his security, never suspected that the beautiful youth pouring his nectar was the very child he feared most. For 3 days Zeus served at the Titan court, memorizing every detail, identifying potential allies and certain enemies, learning the routines and weaknesses of the palace. He watched Kronos consume enormous feasts, trying to fill a stomach that could never be satisfied because it contained 5 growing gods. He observed Rhea, his mother, her eyes dead, except when they flickered toward him, with a recognition she dared not voice. He studied the other titans, noting who seemed discontent with Kronos' increasingly tyrannical rule. On the 3rd night, during a celebration of the cosmos' continued stability, Zeus made his move. The cup he offered Kronos contained the strongest wine mixed with Metis' potion, disguised further with honey and ambrosia. Kronos drank deeply, complimenting the vintage, calling for more. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Lord of Time doubled over, his hands clutching his stomach as it began to convulse with violence that shook the palace foundations. What emerged first was not a child, but a stone. Shot from Kronos' mouth with such force it flew across the throne room and embedded itself in the far wall. Then came Poseidon, fully grown, trident already in hand, seaweed tangled in his hair and murder in his eyes. Hades followed, shadow coiling around him like armor, his face pale from years without light. Hera emerged screaming rage that cracked the ceiling. Demeter appeared withered but furious, plants spontaneously growing and dying around her in waves. Finally, Hestia stepped out, her body wreathed in flames that had been burning inside Kronos for decades, kept alive by pure hatred. The 6 siblings stood together for the first time, united by shared suffering and focused rage. Across from them, Kronos rose from his knees, understanding flooding his features as he recognized Zeus without the disguise. The prophecy was manifesting before his eyes, but the Lord of Time was still the strongest individual god in existence, still commanded powers that could unravel reality itself. The battle that followed destroyed the palace, killed dozens of minor deities who failed to flee quickly enough, and announced to all creation that the war for cosmic supremacy had begun. Zeus's lightning met Kronos's temporal distortions, creating paradoxes that would confuse scholars for millennia. Poseidon's waters fought against the manipulation of time's flow. Hades' shadows consumed moments before they could happen, but they were 6 young gods against the entire Titan establishment, and even their combined might could not overcome millennia of entrenched power. The retreat was strategic rather than panicked. Zeus had always known the first battle would be lost. It was meant to be a declaration, not a victory. As the 6 siblings fled to Mount Olympus, a peak Gaia had been secretly preparing as their fortress, Zeus looked back at the ruins of his father's palace and smiled. The real war was about to begin, and he had plans for allies that would make even the Titans tremble. The Cyclopes and Hecatonchires still waited in Tartarus, and Zeus, unlike his father and grandfather, understood that sometimes the monsters you free become the weapons that ensure victory. The morning after the 6 Olympians fled to their mountain stronghold, the cosmos woke to a new reality. War between immortals was no longer threat or prophecy, but fact carved into existence with divine blood. The sky bled red for 7 days, not from sunset or sunrise, but from wounds in the atmosphere itself, where Zeus's lightning had torn through his father's temporal shields. Rivers ran backward as time itself struggled to maintain coherence. Mortals aged and grew young again in random spurts, some dying of old age at dawn, only to be reborn as infants by nightfall. Kronos stood in the ruins of his palace, the stone that had lived in his stomach for years, still embedded in the wall like an accusation. His rage was quiet, which made it infinitely more terrifying than any roar could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across every realm simultaneously, heard by every god, titan, and conscious being in existence. The words were simple, but they rewrote the rules of reality. Any being who aided the 6 rebels would be unmade, not killed but erased from having ever existed. Their names would disappear from memory, their deeds undone, their very conception prevented. The threat was effective. Many minor deities, who might have sympathized with the young Olympians, immediately declared loyalty to Kronos. The river's gods, the wind gods, the 1,000 forest spirits, and mountain deities all understood that existence, even under tyranny, was preferable to never having been at all. But threats only work on those who have something to lose, and in Tartarus, 3 Cyclopes and 3 Hecatonchires had already lost everything. Zeus knew that 6 gods, no matter how powerful, could not defeat the combined might of all 12 titans and their countless allies. The mathematics of war demanded reinforcement, and so he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his eternal life. He would descend to Tartarus alone, without his siblings' knowledge, and free the monsters that even the titans feared. The journey to Tartarus was not simply traveling downward. It required passing through layers of reality, each more hostile than the last. First came the realm of the dead. Though death as mortals would understand it had not yet been organized, souls wandered aimlessly, not evil enough for punishment, but lacking any system for judgment or reward. They reached toward Zeus as he passed, sensing divinity, but not understanding what it meant. Deeper still, past the rivers that would later be named Styx, Lethe, and Acheron, the very air became hostile. It was thick like water, but burned like acid, designed to discourage any attempt at reaching the prisoners below. Zeus wrapped himself in lightning, using electromagnetic fields to create a bubble of survivable space, but even divine electricity flickered and sparked uncertainly in that oppressive darkness. When he finally reached the prison of the Cyclopes, what he found exceeded his worst expectations. Brontes, master of thunder, had been chained with links forged from silence itself, preventing him from making any sound. Steropes, who commanded lightning, was bound in rubber made from the concept of insulation, his power constantly generated but never released, building up inside him for eons until his single eye blazed with barely contained energy. Arges, the forge master, had his hands encased in ice that renewed itself faster than even divine fire could melt. Zeus approached them with none of the arrogance that would later define his reign. He spoke honestly about the war above, about the choice between Kronos' continued tyranny and the possibility of something better. He made no grand promises, offered no guarantees of paradise. Instead, he simply offered them what they had been denied for so long that they had forgotten its taste, freedom, and the chance for revenge. The Cyclops' response came not in words, but in action. The moment Zeus shattered their chains with lightning that existed before lightning had a name, they began to forge. Right there in the depths of Tartarus, using materials that should not have existed, powered by rage that had fermented for millennia, they created 3 weapons that would reshape divine warfare forever. For Zeus, they forged the Master Bolt, not merely a weapon, but a fundamental force given form. It was lightning distilled to its absolute essence, containing the power of every thunderstorm that would ever exist, past and future, compressed into a javelin that could pierce through anything, including concepts like immortality or inevitability. For Poseidon, they crafted the trident, which was less weapon than key to every lock water had ever created. It could part seas, or create them, summon creatures from depths that had never known light, and most terrifyingly, could dry up any liquid instantly, including the Ichor that flowed through divine veins. For Hades, they created the Helm of Darkness, which did not make its wearer invisible, but rather made them absent, existing in the spaces between existence, present but impossible to perceive, remember, or even conceptualize while worn. But the Hecatonchires were a different matter entirely. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges had been imprisoned even deeper than the Cyclopes, in a section of Tartarus where gravity was a suggestion and physics went to die. Their 100 hands had been bound individually, 600 separate chains each requiring its own key. Their 50 heads had been muzzled with gags that prevented not just speech, but thought itself from forming coherently. Zeus spent 3 days freeing them, and with each broken chain, their rage multiplied. These were not beings that had been merely imprisoned. They had been tortured through sensory deprivation on a scale incomprehensible to anyone who had not experienced it. When the last gag fell from the last head, the sound they made was not a roar or scream, but something worse. Silence so complete, it made sound impossible for 17 seconds across all creation. The journey back to the surface with 6 freed prisoners should have been impossible to hide. Yet Kronos' arrogance worked in Zeus's favor. The Lord of Time was so convinced of Tartarus's impenetrability that he had posted no guards, set no watches, installed no alarms. By the time the escape was discovered, the Olympians had weapons that could kill titans and allies whose very presence was psychological warfare. The first true battle of the Titanomachy took place on the plains of Thessaly, a region that would be erased and recreated 17 times before the war ended. Kronos led the charge personally, bringing with him Hyperion, Atlas, Iapetus, and Crius. The Titans expected to face 6 young gods playing at war. Instead, they met organized devastation. Zeus had positioned the Hecatonchires on 3 separate mountains surrounding the plain. When Kronos' forces entered the valley, 600 hands began throwing boulders, not sequentially, but simultaneously. The sky darkened, not from clouds but from rocks, each one the size of a house, all arriving at the same moment. The sound of impact was creation's first true thunder, a noise so profound that it created echoes that still resonate in storm clouds today. Atlas caught the first wave, his incredible strength allowing him to bat aside dozens of boulders, protecting his fellow titans. But even he could not stop hundreds, and the ones that got through pulverized minor deities who had chosen the wrong side. Divine Ichor painted the valley floor gold, the first immortal blood spilled in anger rather than ceremony. Hyperion responded with light concentrated into beams that could cut through mountains. His radiance was so intense that mortals hundreds of miles away were struck blind, their retinas burned out by reflected glory. But Hades, wearing the helm of darkness, moved through that killing light as if it were gentle sunshine, appearing behind Titan forces to drag them into shadows that had suddenly grown teeth. The battle raged for 7 days without pause. Poseidon turned the valley into an ocean, then just as quickly drained it, leaving Titans gasping and disoriented. Zeus threw lightning that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, striking enemies in the past, present, and future all at once. Demeter caused the earth itself to rebel, ground opening to swallow combatants, then closing to crush them. But the Titans were not without their own terrible powers. Kronos aged sections of the battlefield through millions of years in seconds, turning solid ground to dust, mountains to nothing. When Zeus's lightning approached him, he would slow time around himself, casually stepping aside from bolts that seemed frozen in amber. Iapetus demonstrated why he was called the Piercer, his spear passing through divine shields, as if they were mist, finding gaps in armor that did not exist until his weapon created them. The turning point came when Kreos made a tactical error. Enraged by the constant barrage from the Hecatonchires, he charged Briareus directly, believing his superior combat skills would triumph over raw strength. But fighting a 100-handed opponent was like fighting a coordinated army that shared a single mind. Every punch Kreos threw was blocked by a dozen hands, while others struck from angles that should have been impossible. When Briareus finally got all 100 hands on the Titan simultaneously, the compression was so intense that Kreos's divine form actually cracked, hairline fractures appearing in his immortal essence. The sight of a Titan breaking, even slightly, changed everything. Both sides realized that this war could actually end with permanent casualties, that immortality itself was no longer absolute. The violence that followed made the first 7 days look like a ceremonial dance. Oceanus, who had tried to remain neutral, was forced to choose when Poseidon's new trident began claiming dominion over waters Oceanus had ruled since creation. Their battle turned the Mediterranean region into alternating states of flood and drought, so severe that entire species were created and destroyed in the span of hours. Fish learned to walk to survive the constant environmental changes, then forgot how when the waters returned, then learned again, evolution accelerating to keep pace with divine conflict. The Myths, the Titaness of Justice, made the war's most significant defection. She appeared at Olympus, not as a combatant, but as a messenger, carrying truths that Zeus needed to hear. She revealed that not all Titans supported Kronos, that his paranoia had alienated even his closest allies, that promises of power and position might accomplish what force alone could not. Her information would prove more valuable than any weapon the Cyclopes could forge. The Battle of Thessaly ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. Both sides withdrew, carrying wounded gods whose injuries defied healing. The Olympians had proven they could stand against Titan might, but the Titans had demonstrated that their experience and established power would not be easily overcome. The real war was just beginning, and already the cosmic infrastructure showed signs of strain. Mountains that had stood since Gaia's first breath were now rubble. Rivers ran uphill in some places, downhill in others, and sideways where time had been twisted too severely. The mortal population, Those poor souls caught between warring divinity had been reduced by half. Some were killed by direct divine action, crushed or burned or drowned or aged to dust. Others simply ceased to exist when the reality they occupied was rewritten too many times. But perhaps the most disturbing change was in the gods themselves. Zeus's eyes, which had once shown the bright promise of a better future, now reflected the cold calculation of necessary cruelty. Hera's rage, initially righteous and focused, had spread like infection to encompass everything that opposed her. Poseidon had tasted dominion over waters and found he enjoyed it more than he had expected. The corruption that would later define Olympian rule was not a gradual decay, but a rapid transformation catalyzed by violence. As both armies retreated to their strongholds to prepare for the next engagement, seers and prophets across all realms reported the same vision. They saw thrones cracking, mountains falling, the sky itself shattering like glass. They saw a figure standing amid the ruins, but the vision always ended before revealing whether it was Titan or Olympian. The only certainty was that whoever won this war would rule over a fundamentally broken world, and that victory might be indistinguishable from defeat when measured in the suffering required to achieve it. The third year of the Titanomachy brought an unexpected development that neither side had anticipated, a stalemate so perfect it seemed orchestrated by the fates themselves. Both Olympians and Titans had established impregnable strongholds, Olympus reaching ever skyward, while Othries dug deeper into the earth's bones. Between them stretched a no-man's land of devastation, where reality itself had grown unstable from repeated divine violence. Time moved in circles there, gravity pulled in random directions, and occasionally, patches of pure void would open and swallow anything nearby before sealing themselves with sounds like cosmic sighs. During this period of equilibrium, something remarkable happened. Both sides began to create rather than simply destroy. It was as if the gods needed to prove to themselves that they were more than weapons, that their existence had purpose beyond warfare. The Olympians, young and eager to establish their legitimacy, founded the first true divine court. They assigned roles and responsibilities, created hierarchies and ceremonies, established the traditions that would later govern all divine interaction. Zeus took to kingship with disturbing ease, as if he had been born for the throne he had not yet won. He instituted daily councils where strategies were debated with the same intensity as battles were fought. His siblings found themselves with titles and domains, even though the cosmos was still contested. Poseidon was named Lord of Waters, despite Oceanus still controlling most of them. Hera became Queen of Heaven, while heaven itself remained a battlefield. These titles were aspirational, promises of what would be when victory was achieved, but they served to give structure to what might have descended into chaos. The Titans, not to be outdone, reinforced their own ancient order. Kronos convened the first Titan assembly in centuries, bringing together all 12 original Titans plus their children, the second generation who had grown powerful in their own right. Helios, son of Hyperion, commanded the sun's chariot, with such skill that even during the war day and night maintained their rhythm. Selene, his sister, guided the moon through battlefield debris and divine corpses to ensure the tides still functioned. These younger Titans represented continuity, the promise that even if the first generation fell, their legacy would endure. It was during this strange peace within war that both sides began to truly innovate. The Cyclopes, now permanently allied with the Olympians, established the first divine forges on Olympus's slopes. These were not mere workshops, but miraculous spaces where concepts could be hammered into reality. They created weapons, certainly, but also artifacts of devastating beauty. The Aegis, Zeus's legendary shield, was born during this period, crafted from the hide of Amalthea, the goat that had nursed him, and imbued with the power to inspire either absolute terror or unshakable courage. depending on which side faced it. Hephaestus, though young even by divine standards, apprenticed himself to the Cyclops, with an enthusiasm that concerned his mother Hera. The child god had been born with a deformed foot, an imperfection that should have been impossible for a divine being, yet he transformed this weakness into purpose. His lameness forced him to think rather than simply act, to create tools that multiplied force rather than relying on raw strength. His first great invention was a net so fine it was invisible, yet strong enough to hold a titan, a weapon that would prove crucial in battles to come. The Titans responded with their own creations. Atlas, despite his role as military commander, revealed an unexpected talent for architecture. He designed fortifications that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, walls that an enemy could see but not touch, gates that opened onto different locations depending on who approached them. His masterwork was the Spiral Citadel, a tower that rose infinitely upward while also descending infinitely downward, a paradox of engineering that gave the Titans a fortress that could never be fully surrounded or besieged. Prometheus, the forward-thinking Titan, worked on something far more subtle, but ultimately more significant. He studied the mortals who still survived in the war's margins, these fragile beings who died so easily, yet continued to reproduce, to hope, to create despite the chaos around them. He began to see in them something neither Titans nor Olympians possessed, potential unlimited by immortal perspective. His experiments with elevating mortal consciousness would later lead to his gifting them fire, but during this period, he simply observed and learned. The war's third year also saw the first divine marriages born from alliance rather than love. Zeus took Metis as his wife, not from affection but from calculation. She was the wisest of the Oceanids, daughter of Oceanus, who remained frustratingly neutral, and their union was meant to sway her father to the Olympian cause. What Zeus did not expect was that Metis would become his most valuable advisor, her strategies often proving more effective than his thunderbolts. She introduced the concept of psychological warfare to the Olympians. Why fight Atlas's strength directly when you could convince him that his allies were plotting against him? Why battle Hyperion's light when you could make him doubt what his all-seeing eyes showed him? Her whispers spread through the Titan ranks like poison, creating fractures in their unity that no amount of force could have achieved. The Titans had their own master of manipulation in Menavacine, the Titaness of memory. She weaponized nostalgia, reminding wavering allies of the golden age before the war, of peace and prosperity under Kronos' rule. But more insidiously, she could alter memories, making gods remember slights that never happened, forget oaths they had sworn, believe in victories they had never achieved. Several minor skirmishes during this period ended not with bloodshed but with combatants standing confused, unable to recall why they were fighting. It was also during this supposed golden age within the war that the first true atrocities occurred, not the clean violence of battle, but calculated cruelty designed to break spirits rather than bodies. Zeus ordered the first execution of prisoners. Minor Titans who had surrendered were thrown into Tartarus, not for imprisonment, but for torment. Kronos responded by taking Olympian sympathizers and aging them through millions of years of suffering in seconds, leaving them alive but broken, examples of what awaited traitors. The mortal realm bore witness to divine creativity at its most terrible. The Olympians created the first monsters as living weapons, creatures like the Chimera, designed not just to kill but to terrorize. The Titans responded with plagues that targeted specific bloodlines, ensuring that any mortal family that had aided the Olympians would suffer for generations. Some of these curses persist even now, hereditary sufferings that began as divine punishment in a war most mortals never understood. Yet even in this darkness, moments of genuine beauty emerged. Hestia, eldest of the Olympians but least interested in warfare, established the first sacred hearths. These were neutral grounds where even enemies could meet without violence, where truces could be negotiated, where the wounded could recover regardless of allegiance. The respect for these sanctuaries was one of the few rules both sides honored, perhaps because even gods needed to believe they were fighting for something more than simple dominance. Apollo and Artemis, twins born during the war's chaos, represented a new generation of gods, untainted by the original conflict. Apollo's music could heal wounds that weapons had created, could soothe rage that had burned for years. Artemis brought order to the wild places, organizing the beasts and forests that had been scattered by divine battles into functioning ecosystems again. Their existence proved that creation could continue even in destruction's midst. The architectural marvels of this period would define divine aesthetics forever. Olympus transformed from a mountain into a vertical city. Its buildings define gravity and logic, connected by bridges made of crystallized clouds and stairs carved from sunset light. The throne room at its peak was designed to be visible from anywhere in creation on a clear day, a constant reminder of Olympian ambition. Orthres developed differently, growing like a living organism into the earth. Its halls were carved from single gems the size of mountains, lit by captured starlight, cooled by breezes that had been blowing since the cosmos began. The Titans created a library there that contained not books, but crystallized moments, three-dimensional memories that could be entered and experienced. It held the entire history of creation up to that point, though much of it would be lost when Orthres eventually fell. Trade, surprisingly, continued between the warring factions, not officially, but through intermediaries and neutral parties. Divine weapons needed materials that only certain gods could provide. Ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of immortality, had to be cultivated and distributed even during wartime. This shadow economy created a class of divine merchants who grew rich from war, gods who claimed neutrality while selling to both sides. The most successful of these war profiteers was Hermes. Though he had not yet been born, his future father Zeus was already developing the networks and relationships that his son would later inherit. Secret messages passed between the camps, not always threats or ultimatums, but sometimes offers of conditional surrender, proposals for limited engagement, even the occasional personal note between family members on opposite sides. Rhea, mother to the Olympians, but wife to Kronos, found herself in an impossible position. She attended court at Orthres, while her heart resided on Olympus. Her children begged her to defect openly, but she understood something they did not yet grasp. Her presence at Kronos' side was the only thing preventing him from employing his most extreme measures. Several times she talked him out of plans that would have shattered reality itself, including one attempt to reverse time before his children were born. The fourth year brought the war's most sophisticated battle, an engagement fought entirely through proxies and champions. Both sides had grown wary of direct divine casualties, understanding that each fallen god diminished creation itself. Instead, they blessed mortal heroes with temporary divinity, sending them to fight in divine stead. These proxy wars were somehow more vicious than direct divine combat, as mortals given godlike power often lost all restraint. The greatest of these champions was Heracles, though he would not bear that name for millennia. In this age, he was simply the strongest mortal who had ever lived, blessed by Zeus with might that could crack mountains. His opposite was Antaeus, a son of Gaia, who drew strength from the earth itself, becoming more powerful each time he touched the ground. Their battle lasted 40 days and nights, reshaping the geography of northern Africa, creating the Atlas Mountains from their footprints and the Sahara Desert from the sand their combat kicked into the air. But the true innovation of this golden age within war was not in combat, but in culture. The Olympians established the Muses, 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, in a union that should have been impossible given their parents' opposition. These goddesses represented the first attempt to preserve beauty and knowledge, independent of who won the war. They collected songs, stories, dances, and arts from both sides, creating a cultural archive that would survive regardless of the conflict's outcome. The Titans countered with their own preservation efforts. They created the first written language, not the crude symbols mortals would later develop, but a script that could capture concepts directly, transferring complete understanding from writer to reader without interpretation's filter. They used this to record their version of history, ensuring that even if they lost, their perspective would endure. This period also saw the first divine defections based on ideology rather than fear or opportunity. Prometheus openly joined the Olympians, not because he believed Zeus would be a better ruler, but because he saw in the younger gods a willingness to change that the Titans lacked. His brother Epimetheus followed, though he understood the decision less clearly, acting on instinct rather than foresight. Conversely, some minor Olympian allies switched to the Titan cause when they witnessed Zeus's growing ruthlessness. The river god Scamander, horrified by water being used as a weapon to drown thousands, declared for Kronos. The wind god Boreas, disgusted by messages of peace being carried alongside orders for assassination, withdrew his support entirely, choosing true neutrality over false alliance. The war's grinding stalemate was producing unexpected philosophical developments. Gods who had never questioned their nature began to wonder about purpose, destiny, and free will. If the fates had predetermined this conflict, did their choices matter? If victory was assured to one side, why did both continue to fight? These questions would later form the basis of divine philosophy, but during the war, they were dangerous thoughts that could paralyze a warrior at crucial moments. Athena was born during this period, springing fully formed from Zeus's head after he swallowed Metis whole, fearing a prophecy that their child would overthrow him. Her birth was violent, requiring Hephaestus to split Zeus's skull with an axe, but her emergence marked a turning point. Here was a goddess of wisdom and warfare combined, strategy and strength united. Her first words were not a cry but a battle plan, a method to break the stalemate that had consumed years. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Rather than attack Othries directly or engage in more proxy battles, the Olympians would systematically destroy everything the Titans valued outside their fortress. Every sacred grove, every temple, every monument to Titan glory would be reduced to ash, not to win through military victory, but through psychological exhaustion, to make the cost of continuing exceed the price of surrender. The Titans, through spy networks and divine foresight, learned of this plan before its implementation. Their response revealed how desperate the situation had become. Kronos authorized the use of temporal weapons that he had previously forbidden, devices that could age enemies through their entire potential lifetime in seconds, or reverse them to preconception. The problem with such weapons was that they damaged time itself, creating paradoxes and inconsistencies that threatened causality's foundation. The first use of these temporal weapons occurred at the Battle of the Eternal Spring, a sacred site where seasons met and exchanged power. Kronos himself wielded the Scythe of Seasons, the same adamantine blade that had castrated Ouranos, now modified to cut through temporal dimensions. When he swung it at Zeus, it did not simply try to wound him, but to sever his timeline, to cut his future from his past, to make him never have been while simultaneously always being. Zeus survived only because Clotho, one of the Fates, intervened directly, something that should have been impossible. She appeared on the battlefield, her presence stopping all combat, as even gods recognized higher authority. She spoke a single word that reverberated through all dimensions, declaring that some victories were too expensive for existence to afford. Then she vanished, leaving both armies to contemplate what force was truly controlling their destinies. The golden age within the war was ending. The stalemate had bred innovation and culture, philosophy and art, but it had also fostered hatreds that transcended the original conflict. This was no longer about sons overthrowing fathers or freedom from tyranny. It had become about fundamental differences in how reality should be structured, whether the old order could coexist with the new, whether creation required destruction or destruction enabled creation. As the fifth year began, both sides prepared for what they knew would be the war's decisive phase. The experimental weapons were ready, the alliances as solid as they would ever be, the strategies refined through years of theoretical combat. The Golden Age had been an illusion, a brief moment when both sides caught their breath before the final plunge into absolute warfare. Yet its legacy would outlast the war itself. The structures created during this period, the hierarchies and traditions, the arts and philosophies, would become the foundation of the divine order that followed. The Golden Age of Gods was not a time of peace, but a time when even war was conducted with purpose beyond victory, when even enemies could recognize shared divinity, when even destruction was performed with style. But all golden ages must end, and this one concluded with an event that changed the war's nature forever. Gaia, the Earth Mother who had started this entire cycle, finally chose a side, and her choice would transform a conflict between gods into a battle for existence itself. The fifth year of the Titanomachy marked the moment when the war ceased to be a family dispute and became a cosmic catastrophe that no realm could ignore. The conflict's ripples had reached the edges of existence, disturbing pantheons that had watched from safe distances, believing themselves insulated from Greek divine politics. They were wrong. When gods war, creation itself chooses sides, and neutrality becomes a luxury that even the powerful cannot afford. The Egyptian pantheon was first to seal their borders, Ra commanding Thoth to weave spells that would make the Nile Valley invisible to Greek divine perception. They had learned from watching, understanding that this war was different from the cyclical conflicts they managed through ritual and order. Mahat, the goddess of truth and justice, declared that any Greek deity, Titan, or Olympian who crossed into Egyptian territory would be unmade by the fundamental incompatibility of their chaotic essence with Egypt's cosmic order. The threat was not idle. When a minor Greek river god accidentally drifted into the Nile during a battle, he simply ceased, not died, but stopped existing, his very concept erased by Mahat's absolute law. The Norse gods, still young by divine standards, observed with the fascination of those who see their own future in another's present. Odin hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, not seeking wisdom this time, but trying to understand the patterns of patricide and power that seemed to govern all pantheons. What he saw in his visions made him establish the first laws of Ragnarok, accepting that endings were inevitable, but trying to ensure his would be more honorable than what he witnessed in Greece. But the war's influence spread beyond divine politics into the fundamental structure of reality. The constant use of temporal weapons by Kronos and reality-altering lightning by Zeus had created cracks in the cosmic foundation. These fissures leaked possibility, causing spontaneous evolution in mortal species, creating hybrid creatures that should not exist, allowing dreams to manifest physically in the waking world. In some regions, the boundary between life and death became so thin that souls could wander out of their bodies during sleep, sometimes returning to the wrong flesh upon waking. The Titans recognized this expanding influence as an opportunity. If the war must spread, they reasoned, let it spread to their advantage. Hyperion, master of light and observation, established the first divine intelligence network that crossed pantheon boundaries. His agents were not spies in the traditional sense, but particles of light itself, photons encoded with consciousness that could travel anywhere illumination reached, recording everything they touched. Through this network, the Titans learned disturbing truths. The Hindu gods were not merely watching, but actively containing the war's effects, using complex divine mathematics to calculate probability streams and prevent the conflict from achieving critical mass. The Jade Emperor in the celestial realm had already written 17 different endings to the war, storing them in scrolls that could rewrite reality, if opened, waiting to impose whichever conclusion best served cosmic balance. Zeus, learning of these international divine machinations through Metis's wisdom, realized that victory over the Titans might be meaningless if other pantheons decided the Olympians were too dangerous to exist. He needed to transform the war from a Greek problem into a universal principle, making his victory necessary for cosmic stability rather than just personal ambition. The solution came from an unexpected source. Aphrodite, born from Arenas' severed genitals, and technically older than both Titans and Olympians, had remained neutral through careful manipulation of desire and distraction. She approached Zeus with a proposition that would change divine warfare forever. Love, she explained, was the only force that transcended pantheon boundaries. If the Olympians could make other pantheons love them, or at least desire their victory, geographical borders would become irrelevant. The campaign that followed was more insidious than any battle. Olympian emissaries, beautiful and charming, appeared in foreign divine courts, offering gifts, alliances, and marriages. Hermes, though not yet born, would later perfect these diplomatic missions, but their foundation was laid when Apollo seduced the Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu into providing eastern light, while Helios was embattled, when Artemis hunted with Skadi in the Norse mountains, teaching her new ways to track divine prey, when Dionysus, still developing in Zeus's thigh, sent dreams of future wine and celebration to gods who had never known intoxication. The Titans responded with their own influence campaign, but theirs was based on fear rather than desire. They revealed to other pantheons what the Olympians truly were: children who had devoured their path to power, who had freed monsters from justified imprisonment, who broke cosmic law when it suited them. Kronos personally visited the Mesopotamian gods, showing them visions of Zeus's future tyranny, the rape and abuse that would characterize his reign, the way he would treat mortals as playthings rather than responsibilities. This divine propaganda war created the first true theological debates. Gods who had never questioned their own existence now argued about the nature of divinity itself. Did might make right in cosmic terms? Was the natural order whatever currently existed, or was there an ideal state that gods should aspire to reach? Could perfect beings change? And if they could change, were they ever perfect? These questions spread through divine ranks like infection, causing existential crises in beings who had never experienced doubt. The mortal realm became the primary battlefield for this influence war. Both sides recognized that mortal worship was not just ego gratification, but actual power, a resource that could tip cosmic balances. The Olympians introduced themselves to mortal populations through miracles and benevolence, healing diseases, ensuring harvests, protecting from natural disasters they themselves had often caused. Every saved life was a future worshiper, every grateful prayer a tiny amount of power added to their reserves. The Titans took a different approach, embedding themselves in mortal racial memory as the ancient ones, the true gods who existed before upstart children corrupted paradise. They influenced mortal dreams, creating nostalgic longing for a golden age that had never quite existed as perfectly as remembered. They became the gods of the way things used to be, a powerful position in cultures watching their world torn apart by divine conflict. This competition for mortal allegiance led to the first divine marketing. Temples became advertisements, their architecture designed not just for worship, but for impression. Statues grew larger and more elaborate, each pantheon trying to prove their gods were more worthy of devotion. Religious festivals became recruitment events, where free food and entertainment came with subtle indoctrination about which gods truly deserved prayer. The escalation reached absurd proportions when both sides began creating designer mortals, humans specifically crafted to worship their creators exclusively. These beings, more beautiful and talented than natural humans, were placed in population centers as living advertisements for divine superiority. The problem arose when these enhanced mortals began breeding with regular humans, creating demigod bloodlines that would complicate divine politics for millennia. Regional gods found themselves forced to choose sides or be crushed between them. River gods discovered their waters diverted to supply divine armies. Mountain gods watched their peaks converted into fortresses. Forest deities saw their trees harvested for weapons and siege engines. The middle ground was literally disappearing, consumed by the expanding war effort. Some gods attempted to profit from the situation. Plutus, god of wealth, established the first divine mercenary company, offering the services of minor deities to whichever side paid better. His forces would fight for the Titans on odd days and the Olympians on even ones, arrangement that continued until Zeus personally struck him with lightning that transformed half his body to gold, making him too heavy to move quickly enough for combat. The war's influence even reached the realm of abstract concepts. Love became weaponized when Aphrodite's arrows were modified to create obsession rather than affection. Justice split into two competing definitions: Themis's ancient law versus Zeus's new order. Truth itself became relative, with each side having their own goddess of veracity, who swore their version of events was correct. Languages evolved to accommodate the war. New words were created for concepts that had never existed, like deicide for god-killing, Titanomachy for god-war, chronophage for time-eater, describing weapons that consumed temporal energy. Mortals began swearing oaths not by individual gods, but by the conflict itself, saying things like "by the war's end," or "as surely as gods bleed," phrases that acknowledged divine vulnerability. The cultural impact was equally profound. Art split into two schools, Titanic and Olympian, each with distinct styles and themes. Titanic art emphasized permanence and tradition, using materials meant to last eternity. Olympian art celebrated change and innovation, creating pieces designed to evolve and transform over time. The competition between these schools produced the greatest divine artworks ever created, though most were destroyed in the war's final years. Music became a battlefield where Apollo's harmonies fought Orpheus's melodies. Though Orpheus had not yet been born, the future echo of his music traveled backward through time, influenced by the war's temporal distortions, creating songs that existed before their composer. These temporal paradoxes in art would later inspire mortal philosophers to question the nature of causality itself. The spreading influence reached its peak when the war began affecting concepts that transcended physical reality. Mathematics changed in regions where divine combat had occurred, with numbers behaving differently, 2 + 2 = 5 in spaces where reality had been stretched. Logic itself became unreliable near battlefields, with contradictions becoming simultaneously true, paradoxes resolving into new forms of truth that mortal minds could not fully comprehend. Even death, that most fundamental of transitions, became negotiable. The war had killed so many minor deities that the underworld's infrastructure collapsed. Souls piled up at the Styx's banks with no ferryman to carry them. Some wandered back to life simply because death could not process them. Others dissolved into component memories that attached themselves to living minds, creating the first cases of ancestral memory inheritance. The influence spread until there was no corner of existence untouched by the war. Every prayer carried partisan implications. Every ritual honored one side while insulting the other. Every birth was seen as adding soldiers to future armies. Every death was tallied in the cosmic accounting of which side was winning. The war had become not just an event, but the lens through which all existence was viewed, the context that gave meaning to everything else. As the 6th year began, both sides realized they had created something beyond their control. The war had taken on its own life, its own purpose, its own momentum, that carried them forward regardless of their desires. They were no longer fighting to win, but fighting because stopping had become impossible. The influence they had spread had created expectations, obligations, and consequences that demanded resolution. The stage was set for the next phase, where the cracks in divinity that had been spreading would finally break open, revealing the rot that had been growing beneath the golden surface of both pantheons. The war was about to show its true face, and even the gods would recoil from what they had become. The seventh year of the Titanomachy began with an event that shattered divine assumptions about their own nature. Kronos, the titan of intelligence and the axis of heaven, simply stopped, not died, not retreated, not surrendered, but ceased functioning in the middle of a battle. He stood frozen on the field of Pelion, his eyes vacant, his mind collapsed under the weight of understanding too much. He had calculated every possible outcome of the war simultaneously and found them all equally meaningless. The sight of a titan broken by his own thoughts rather than enemy action sent waves of existential dread through both armies. Zeus found Kronos first, approaching carefully with lightning crackling between his fingers. But the titan did not react, did not even seem to perceive the Olympian's presence. When Zeus touched him, he felt something that would haunt him until Kratos finally ended his reign. The absolute emptiness of a god who had thought himself into non-existence. Kronos remained standing for 3 days before finally toppling, his body turning to crystal that reflected not light but possibilities, showing anyone who looked into it all the lives they might have lived instead. This was the first true crack, but others followed rapidly. The Titaness of sight and gold's shine began seeing through time simultaneously, experiencing every moment of her existence at once. Her screams created the first solar flares as her husband Hyperion tried desperately to narrow her vision back to a single timeline. She survived, but she was never the same, speaking in temporal riddles, referring to events that had not happened yet as memories and treating ancient history as future possibility. The Olympians were not immune to this divine degradation. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, became so connected to the earth that she began experiencing every seed's growth, every plant's death, every grain's consumption simultaneously. The sensory overload drove her into catatonic states where she would stand motionless for weeks, tears streaming down her face as she felt millions of life cycles beginning and ending within her consciousness. Her absence caused the first divine famine, with even immortals feeling hunger as ambrosia crops failed without her blessing. The war had become a meat grinder of sanity, each battle costing not just physical essence, but psychological stability. Gods who had existed since creation's dawn were discovering that immortality meant endless accumulation of trauma without the mercy of forgetting. Every wound received, every ally lost, every atrocity committed was perfectly preserved in divine memory, building into mountains of grief that threatened to crush even infinite minds. Prometheus, despite having joined the Olympians, began showing signs of prophetic madness. His gift of foresight had become a curse as the war's temporal weapons created multiple potential futures that all seemed equally real. He would hold conversations with Zeus about battles that might happen, delivering victory reports for conflicts that were simultaneously won and lost, existing in superposition until observed. His warnings became increasingly frantic and contradictory, sometimes telling his allies to retreat from victories and advance into defeats. The breaking point came when Iapetus, Prometheus's father, confronted his son on the battlefield. Neither wanted to fight the other, but the war's momentum demanded it. Their battle was less physical combat than philosophical debate conducted through violence. Each blow exchanged arguments about fate versus free will. Each parry questioned whether gods could truly change or were locked into patterns established at their creation. When Iapetus finally fell, pierced by a spear his son had crafted but never wanted to use, Both gods wept ichor that burned holes in reality where it fell. Even victory was becoming poison. Ares, though young, had grown drunk on divine violence. His essence warping from protective warrior to sadistic killer. He began taking trophies from fallen enemies, not weapons or armor, but pieces of their divine essence, incorporating their rage into his own until he became less god of war than war itself, a walking manifestation of conflict that started battles simply by existing. His own family began to fear him, recognizing that he was becoming something that might be worse than any titan. The fates themselves seemed to be fraying under the strain of maintaining causality in a war where time was a weapon. Clotho's thread of life began showing knots and tangles that should not exist. Leucus's measurements became inconsistent, some lives lasting seconds while others stretched beyond meaning. Atropos's shears hesitated before cutting, as if she herself was uncertain when endings should come. Their confusion rippled through existence, causing spontaneous births and deaths, creatures aging backward, and futures preceding their pasts. Hera's paranoia reached pathological levels as she began seeing betrayal everywhere. She accused Zeus of planning to replace her the moment the war ended, of already selecting new queens from among the titanesses they would capture. Her jealousy manifested physically, creating storms that attacked any female deity who spoke to her husband, regardless of context or intention. The marriage that was supposed to represent divine unity became a daily demonstration of how war corrupted even the strongest bonds. The Titans fared no better in maintaining their sanity. Kronos' fear of the prophecy had evolved into full-blown temporal psychosis. He existed in multiple moments simultaneously, fighting battles in the past while planning for futures that might never occur. His consciousness scattered across timeline fragments, each piece believing it was the real Kronos, leading to occasions where multiple versions of him would appear on the same battlefield, sometimes fighting each other over strategic disagreements. Oceanus, who had maintained neutrality through political skill, finally cracked when he realized the war had poisoned all water everywhere. Every drop carried the memory of divine blood. Every river ran red with diluted ichor. Every ocean wave whispered the names of the dissolved dead. He retreated to the deepest trenches, trying to find water that remembered peace. But even there, the war's contamination had spread. His weeping added new seas to the world, bodies of water that tasted of divine sorrow. The breakdown of divine nature revealed uncomfortable truths about immortality. Gods could not die, but they could be broken into pieces that no longer recognized themselves. They could not be destroyed, but they could be transformed into things that wished they could cease. They could not forget, but they could go mad from remembering too much. The perfect beings were proving perfectly capable of imperfection, and that realization shattered faith in divine infallibility. Rituals began to break down as gods forgot or deliberately ignored their cosmic responsibilities. Helios would sometimes refuse to drive the sun chariot, leaving the world in darkness for days until Selene reluctantly pulled double duty. The seasons became erratic as the Horae, goddesses of time's passage, argued among themselves about whether spring should follow winter or whether autumn deserved to come first. Rivers flowed uphill when their gods were distracted by battle. Mountains migrated when their deities felt threatened. The first divine suicides began during this period, though suicide for an immortal was more creative than mortals could imagine. Menoetius, titan of violent anger, deliberately provoked Zeus into striking him with a thunderbolt so powerful it scattered his consciousness across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. He still existed, but spread so thin that he could never again form a coherent thought. His brother Atlas would later claim he could sometimes hear Menoetius in radio static, trying to pull himself back together, but lacking the concentration to succeed. Minor deities began disappearing entirely, not killed, but choosing to dissolve into their core concepts rather than maintain consciousness in the war-torn reality. River gods became just water, mountain gods returned to stone, forest deities merged back into trees. They gave up individuality for the peace of unconscious existence, a retreat that diminished the richness of reality, but seemed preferable to continued awareness of the horror surrounding them. Treaties became impossible when gods could no longer trust their own perceptions, let alone each other's words. A peace negotiation between Themis and Zeus ended with both sides convinced they had been betrayed, though recordings of the event showed they had actually agreed on all points. The problem was that each god was experiencing different versions of reality, their damaged psyches interpreting the same events through incompatible frameworks of understanding. The mortal realm reflected divine madness in waves of inexplicable behavior. Entire cities would simultaneously decide to walk into the sea. Farmers would plant stones expecting grain harvests. Children would age to elderly in hours, then return to infancy by sunset. The fundamental laws that governed mortal existence were becoming suggestions rather than rules, and humanity teetered on the edge of extinction, not from divine violence, but from reality's increasing instability. Some gods attempted to maintain sanity through obsessive focus on single tasks. Hephaestus locked himself in his forge, creating weapons of increasing complexity, each one a meditation that kept his mind from fragmenting. His hammering became the heartbeat of Olympus, the only constant rhythm in a world where time itself had become unreliable. When he stopped to rest, other gods would panic, fearing that silence meant their craftsman had finally broken like so many others. Others found stability in extremity. Dionysus, still unborn but already influencing events through temporal paradox, sent visions of wine and madness as medicine. He argued that if sanity was impossible, organized insanity might be preferable to chaotic breakdown. His mystery cults, founded before his birth, taught that divine madness was not a failure, but an evolution, a new form of consciousness adapted to impossible reality. The cracks in divinity were not healing but spreading, connecting into networks of damage that threatened the structural integrity of existence itself. Gods were discovering that immortality without sanity was torture, that power without purpose was poison, that victory in a war that destroyed the victors was indistinguishable from defeat. As year 7 ended and year 8 began, both sides faced a terrible recognition. They were no longer fighting to rule creation, but to survive what they had made of it. The war had become a disease that infected everything it touched, and the gods themselves were the primary carriers. The question was no longer who would win, but whether anything worth ruling would remain when the fighting finally stopped. The next phase would require measures so extreme that even broken gods hesitated to employ them. But hesitation was a luxury that the accelerating collapse would not allow. The cracks had shown that divinity itself was flawed, and those flaws were about to be exploited by powers that should have remained imprisoned forever. The 8th year of the Titanomachy brought forth the apocalypse that even gods feared to name. When Zeus released the Hecatonchires from their deepest imprisonment, he unleashed more than allies. He freed vengeance itself, given form in 3 brothers whose rage had fermented in darkness for eons beyond counting. Kratos, Briareus, and Gyges emerged from Tartarus, not as the prisoners they had been, but as something transformed by isolation and agony into weapons of pure retribution. Their first act upon reaching the surface was not to thank Zeus but to scream, a sound that lasted 17 hours and killed everything mortal within 1,000 miles. It was not intentionally murderous but simply the release of suffering so compressed that its expression became lethal. Birds fell from the sky as stone. Fish floated to the surface as glass. Humans simply ceased, their souls dispersed by sound waves that existed in spectrums consciousness could not survive. When the screaming finally stopped, the 3 brothers stood silent for 7 days, their 100 hands clenched into fists, their 50 heads each processing different aspects of their trauma. Zeus approached them with the respect one shows to barely controlled disasters, offering freedom in exchange for alliance. Gyges spoke first, his voice like grinding continental plates, asking not about victory or payment, but simply whether they would be allowed to hurt those who had hurt them. When Zeus confirmed they could, all three brothers smiled, an expression so terrible that several minor Olympian deities fled rather than witness what came next. The Hecatonchires did not fight like other gods. They did not use weapons or magic or cosmic forces. They simply grabbed and threw, but their throwing was an art form elevated to apocalyptic expression. Each brother could hurl 100 objects simultaneously with perfect coordination, their 50 heads calculating trajectories that should have been impossible. They turned the battlefield into a three-dimensional reign of death, where up became down and sideways became everywhere. Their first major engagement was the Battle of the Phlegra Plains, where Kronos had assembled the largest Titan army of the war. 30,000 minor deities, spirits and divine servants stood in perfect phalanxes, their shields locked, their spears gleaming with enchantments that could pierce Olympian armor. Kronos himself stood at their center, the scythe of seasons spinning temporal shields that aged attacks to nothing before they could land. The Hecatonchires approached slowly, deliberately, their footsteps shaking the ground in rhythms that disrupted formation discipline. They did not charge, or roar, or make dramatic proclamations. They simply began picking up mountains from the surrounding range, 100 peaks grabbed simultaneously by each brother, 300 mountains held aloft like a forest of stone growing from their massive hands. The throwing began with mechanical precision, not a wild barrage, but targeted devastation. Each mountain aimed at specific points in the Titan formation, where impact would cause maximum disruption. The sky darkened, not from clouds, but from solid stone, peaks that had stood since Gaia's birth now weaponized into divine artillery. The sound was indescribable, not just impact but the screaming of stone, forced to move faster than nature intended, the shrieking of air compressed to plasma, the thunder of gravity temporarily defeated. Kronos' temporal shields held for exactly 13 seconds before the sheer mass overwhelmed his control. Mountains struck his forces with impact, forces that created new valleys, that compressed divine soldiers into new forms of matter, that generated temperatures which turned sand to glass and glass to light. The organized army became chaos in moments, disciplined formations scattering as soldiers tried to dodge stones larger than cities. But the true horror was the Hecatonchires' coordination. They did not throw randomly, but in patterns, creating kill zones, where mountains would strike from multiple angles simultaneously, leaving no escape routes. They threw in sequences that trapped fleeing enemies between impacts, that created avalanche chains, where one strike would trigger others, that used the debris from shattered peaks as secondary projectiles. Atlas alone stood firm, his infinite strength allowing him to catch mountains, to throw them back, to protect those near him with a moving shield of deflected stone. His duel with Briareus became legendary, the strongest Titan against the most coordinated Hecatonchire, mountains flying between them, like arguments in a debate conducted through geology. For 3 hours they exchanged peaks, each throw carrying enough force to crack continents, each catch requiring strength that redefined physical laws. The battle ended when Atlas made a tactical error, focusing all his attention on Briareus while forgetting the other brothers. Kratos and Gyges coordinated a throw of 200 mountains simultaneously, all aimed at the space Atlas would occupy. In the 3 seconds it would take him to catch and return Briareus's latest projectile. Even infinite strength had limits when faced with infinite mass arriving from infinite angles. Atlas was not crushed but buried, imprisoned under a mountain range that would later be named after him, temporarily removed from the war by sheer weight. The psychological impact on the Titan forces was devastating. These were not noble warriors or cosmic forces, but incarnations of primitive violence, uninterested in glory or honor, or even victory, beyond the simple satisfaction of destroying those who had allowed their imprisonment. They fought without words, without battle cries, without any expression except occasional smiles when particularly effective throws liquefied enemy formations. Zeus quickly realized he had unleashed something he could not fully control. The Hecatonchires obeyed their alliance, but interpreted orders broadly. Told to attack Titan forces at Thessaly, they threw not just mountains, but chunks of Thessaly itself, creating the first archipelagos by breaking landmasses into island chains. Asked to defend Olympus, they surrounded it with a ring of thrown peaks that made approach impossible, but also trapped the Olympians inside their own fortress. Their presence changed the war's entire dynamic. Battles that might have lasted days ended in minutes under mountain bombardment. Titan strongholds that had stood since creation fell to coordinated geological assault. The Hecatonchires did not capture or occupy. They simply destroyed, leaving behind landscapes so altered that maps became useless, geography itself needing constant revision. Kronos tried various strategies to counter them. He sent assassins, but beings with 50 heads each never truly slept and could not be surprised. He tried temporal attacks, but the brothers had spent so long in Tartarus that they existed partially outside normal time flow, making them difficult to age or reverse. He attempted negotiation, offering them better terms than Zeus, but they were beyond corruption, wanting nothing except the expression of accumulated rage. The Titans' response was to free their own monsters, beings they had imprisoned for good reasons now released out of desperation. They unleashed Campi, the dragon woman who had guarded Tartarus before the Hecatonchires' escape, her body covered in animal heads that each breathed different forms of death. They freed Echidna, mother of monsters, who immediately began birthing new abominations specifically designed to fight hundred-handed giants. They even considered releasing Typhon, though that final monster was deemed too dangerous even for desperate times. The escalation of monstrous forces transformed the war from divine conflict to cosmic horror. Battles became less strategic and more survivalistic, with both sides simply trying to point their monsters at enemies while avoiding being consumed themselves. The Chimera fought the Hydra over who would get to devour which gods. The Sphinx asked riddles that killed those who answered incorrectly, but also those who answered correctly, having gone mad from divine conflict. Cerberus, not yet born, but pulled backward through time by temporal weapons, guarded various locations simultaneously, sometimes for Olympians, sometimes for Titans, always for death itself. Yet through all this chaos, the Hecatonchires remained the most effective weapons, not because they were strongest or smartest, but because their rage gave them focus that other monsters lacked. They did not get distracted or confused or tempted. They simply identified Titans and threw mountains at them, a simple strategy that proved devastatingly effective. Their most significant contribution came during the siege of Othrys, when Zeus finally felt confident enough to assault the Titan stronghold directly. The fortress had been considered impregnable, built into Mount Othrys itself, with defenses designed by Atlas and magic woven by Heke. Previous assault attempts had failed catastrophically, with attacking forces aged to dust by Kronos' temporal fields, or lost in dimensional mazes that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The Hecatonchires solved the problem simply. They did not attack the fortress, they attacked the mountain. For 7 days and nights, they threw pieces of neighboring peaks at Mount Othrys itself, not trying to breach walls, but to demolish the entire geographical feature. Each impact shook foundations that had been stable since Earth's formation. Avalanches became constant, making approach or escape equally impossible. The mountain began to collapse into itself, floors becoming ceilings, walls becoming floors, architecture surrendering to geology. Kronos was forced to evacuate, abandoning the stronghold that had been Titan power's symbol. As he fled, he watched the Hecatonchires systematically dismantle what remained, throwing pieces of his palace into the sea, scattering his throne across continents, ensuring nothing remained that could be reclaimed or rebuilt. The message was clear that this was not war but extermination, not victory but annihilation. The sight of Overthrews falling broke something in Titan morale that could never be repaired. If their greatest fortress could be destroyed by three brothers throwing rocks, what hope did they have? Defections accelerated, with minor Titans choosing surrender over standing in the path of geological ammunition. Even loyal Titans began discussing terms, trying to negotiate endings that would leave them existing in some form rather than scattered across the landscape. But the Hecatonchires were not finished. Their vengeance had only begun to be expressed. Years of imprisonment had given them a long list of grievances, and they intended to address each one with throne mountains. They remembered every moment of darkness, every second of chains bite, every instant of isolation, and they would repay it all with interest calculated in devastating impacts. As Year 8 ended, the war had transformed from a conflict between divine dynasties into something more primitive and terrible. The Hecatonchires had introduced a form of warfare that made noble combat impossible, that reduced strategy to survival, that transformed battlefields into broken landscapes where even victory looked like defeat. They were vengeance incarnate, and vengeance, the gods were learning, was a force that once unleashed could not be controlled, only endured until it exhausted itself or consumed everything in its path. The question was whether anything would remain when that consumption was complete, whether the world they were fighting to rule would survive the fighting itself. The Hecatonchires did not care about such questions. They had mountains to throw and Titans to bury, and they would continue until one or the other ran out. Given that they could throw the same mountain multiple times, by gathering the pieces, the Titans would run out first. Year 9 arrived with both Pantheons, understanding that conventional warfare had failed. The rules that had governed divine conflict since existence began were being discarded like broken weapons. What followed was an arms race of atrocity, each side justifying increasingly unthinkable actions as necessary for survival. The gods were about to discover that when immortals abandon morality, the resulting horror exceeds what even divine minds can fully comprehend. Zeus initiated the descent into true darkness with a decision that would haunt Greek mythology forever. He authorized the use of mortals, not as soldiers, but as components in divine weapons. Human souls, he had discovered, could be compressed into ammunition for weapons that could wound even Titans. Each shot required approximately 10,000 mortal lives, condensed into bullets of pure life force that bypassed divine immunity. The screaming of these soul bullets as they flew became the war's most distinctive sound, a keening that made even hardened warriors weep. Kronos' response was to weaponize time itself in ways that violated causality's most basic laws. He created temporal loops where enemy gods would experience the same death repeatedly, feeling the pain fresh each time while retaining memory of previous iterations. Ores was trapped in one such loop for what he experienced as 700 years, but was only 3 days in external time, dying from the same spear thrust over and over until Zeus managed to shatter the temporal prison. The god of war emerged functionally insane, laughing at inappropriate moments and flinching from wounds that had healed centuries ago in his subjective experience. The Olympians then discovered they could forge weapons from abstract concepts. Athena created a spear made from the idea of betrayal itself, a weapon that would turn any struck target against their closest allies. When she used it on the Titan Menoetius during the Battle of Corinth, he immediately attacked his brother Atlas. The confusion and horror in both brothers' eyes as they fought against their will, becoming a defining image of the war's cruelty. The spear was so effective that Zeus eventually ordered it destroyed, fearing it might be turned against Olympians. Not to be outdone in conceptual warfare, the Titans began stealing fundamental forces from reality to fuel their weapons. Hyperion extracted light from entire regions, creating zones of absolute darkness where even divine vision failed. These shadow realms became hunting grounds where Titan assassins could strike unseen. Several minor Olympian deities simply vanished into these dark zones, their fate unknown, their screams sometimes heard but never located. The escalation reached new depths when both sides began experimenting with divine breeding programs. The Olympians forced captured Titanesses to bear hybrid children, creatures that combined Olympian and Titan traits in unstable configurations. These offspring were raised as weapons, their minds broken from birth, their bodies designed for single battles before they collapsed from internal contradiction. The Titans responded by breeding their own monsters, crossing divine bloodlines that should never have mixed, creating abominations that even their creators could not fully control. Prometheus, despite his allegiance to the Olympians, attempted to stop the breeding programs by revealing their location to Titan forces. His betrayal of betrayal created a paradox that shattered his gift of foresight, leaving him unable to see beyond the present moment. Zeus's punishment was swift and creative, chaining Prometheus to a rock where an eagle would eat his liver daily, the organ regenerating each night. But this famous torture was not for stealing fire for humans. That came later. This was for trying to maintain moral boundaries in a war that had abandoned morality entirely. The environmental damage from desperate measures became catastrophic. The Titans poisoned entire river systems with water from the Styx, making them lethal to any non-divine being. Lands touched by these cursed waters became permanent dead zones where nothing would grow for millennia. The Olympians retaliated by seeding clouds with lightning essence, creating storms that rained electrical death across Titan territories. The constant supernatural weather created the first hurricanes, tornadoes and typhoons, natural disasters that would plague the world forever as echoes of divine desperation. Both sides began raiding other pantheons for weapons and knowledge. Zeus sent Hermes, not yet born but pulled from the future through temporal manipulation, to steal fire techniques from the Hindu gods. The mission succeeded, but the theft created a divine diplomatic incident that would result in pantheons closing their borders permanently to Greek deities. The Titans attempted similar raids on Egyptian magic reserves, only to have their agents returned as hieroglyphic warnings carved into still-living divine flesh. The use of forbidden magic became commonplace. The Olympians employed necromancy to raise dead Titans as undead servants, their bodies animated but souls trapped in perpetual agony. These zombie gods retained their powers, but not their will, fighting with the same strength they had in life, but with a horrifying vacancy in their eyes. The psychological impact on living Titans seeing their fallen brothers desecrated was devastating. Several Titans surrendered rather than risk such a fate. Kronos countered with something worse, extracting the potential futures of his enemies and killing those instead. Gods would suddenly age or weaken as their possible futures were murdered, leaving them with only diminished presence. Hestia nearly faded from existence when Kronos killed every future where she maintained the sacred hearth, saved only by Zeus creating new potential timelines through sheer will. The depths of depravity reached their nadir with the creation of pain itself as a weapon. Previously, pain had been merely a sensation, unpleasant but purposeful, warning of damage. The Titans transformed it into an entity, a living force that could exist independently of injury. They unleashed clouds of pure agony that would envelop enemies, causing the experience of every possible form of suffering simultaneously without any actual damage. Gods driven mad by pain that had no source and thus no end begged for death that their immortality denied. Zeus's scientists, a term that did not exist but describes the gods, tasked with developing new horrors, discovered how to weaponize love and fear simultaneously. They created emotional bombs that would explode in waves of contradictory feelings, making enemies love what they feared and fear what they loved. Families turned on each other in confusion. Allies became suspicious of their closest friends. The very concept of trust became unreliable in the blast radius of these weapons. The magical nuclear option was nearly deployed when both sides independently developed reality erasure weapons. These devices would not destroy but uncreate, removing targets from having ever existed. The paradoxes involved were so severe that test firings created zones where causality simply stopped functioning. Past, present, and future became meaningless concepts in these areas. A treaty was hastily signed specifically banning these weapons after a test accidentally uncreated 3 days of history, leaving both sides confused about battles that had both happened and never occurred. Biological warfare entered divine combat when Demeter, pushed beyond sanity by the war's horrors, created the first divine plague. It spread through Ichor contact, causing gods to slowly transform into plants. The infected retained consciousness but lost mobility, becoming divine trees that could only watch and suffer. The plague spread through both armies before Asclepius, pulled from the future like many gods of this era, developed a cure. Groves of god trees from this period still exist, conscious but unable to communicate, eternal monuments to desperate measures. The Titans developed their own plague that caused gods to forget they were gods. The infected would lose their powers gradually, then their memories, finally their divine nature itself, becoming mortal and aging to death within days. The terror this caused exceeded any battlefield defeat. Gods began avoiding each other, fearing infection, destroying the unit cohesion both armies required. The plague was eventually contained, but not before several minor deities experienced mortality and death, their terrified confusion in their final moments haunting those who witnessed it. Dimensional weapons opened doorways to realms that should have remained closed. The Olympians summoned entities from spaces between spaces, beings that existed in geometries that hurt to perceive. These angular horrors served no side, attacking anything with shape, forcing both armies to temporarily alliance against threats from outside reality. Some doorways could not be closed, becoming permanent wounds in existence that leaked impossibility into the world. The Titans accessed the dreams of their enemies, turning sleep into vulnerability. They crafted nightmares that would continue after waking, overlaying themselves onto reality. Zeus spent 3 months unable to distinguish between dream and waking, fighting imaginary battles while real ones raged around him. The confusion nearly cost the Olympians several major engagements before Hypnos, the god of sleep, was recruited to provide protection. Desperate measures included attempts to rewrite the fundamental laws of existence. The Olympians tried to change the nature of defeat, making it impossible for them to lose by altering the definition of loss itself. The Titans attempted to edit the concept of victory, ensuring that winning would automatically destroy the winner. These reality revision attempts created logical paradoxes that manifested as physical spaces where nothing made sense, where water flowed upward, fire froze, and existence itself became uncertain. The War Crimes Tribunal, that would never convene, would have struggled to categorize what happened when both sides began using temporal assassination, killing enemies in the past before they could become threats. The paradoxes created were resolved by reality through increasingly strained logic, creating alternate timelines that sometimes merged with the primary one, doubling or tripling the number of certain gods, all equally real and equally confused. As Year 9 ended, both pantheons had to face what they had become. The noble gods who had begun this war for freedom and justice were now barely distinguishable from the monsters they fought. Every line had been crossed. every taboo broken, every unthinkable act thought and performed. The desperate measures had worked in the sense that enemies were destroyed, but they had also destroyed something fundamental about divinity itself. The infrastructure of existence was failing. Reality required constant maintenance just to remain coherent. The laws of physics had become suggestions that needed divine enforcement to function. Mortality and immortality had begun to blur, with some mortals unable to die and some gods experiencing death. The desperate measures had won battles, but might have lost the war by destroying what they were fighting to control. Both Zeus and Kronos began to realize that victory achieved through these means would be meaningless. They would rule over a broken reality populated by traumatized survivors, governing through fear rather than respect, maintaining order through threat rather than law. But stopping seemed impossible. The desperate measures had created their own momentum, each atrocity demanding response, each response escalating the horror. The weapons and tactics developed during Year 9 would cast shadows across all future mythology. Every cursed artifact, every labyrinthine punishment, every creative torture that would appear in Greek myths had its origin in this period, when gods abandoned their divinity in pursuit of victory. The desperate measures proved that immortals could be just as petty, cruel, and short-sighted as mortals, perhaps more so because their mistakes would last forever. The 10th year of the Titanomachy began with a lie so perfectly crafted that even omniscient gods failed to see through it. Zeus approached his grandmother Gaia with a proposal that would end the war through negotiation rather than annihilation. He spoke of exhaustion, of the irreversible damage to creation, of the need for peace before reality itself collapsed. His words were honey poisoned with truth, for everything he said about the war's cost was accurate. What he hid was his intention to make that cost worthwhile through absolute victory, achieved by betrayal rather than battle. Gaia, the Earth Mother, had watched her children and grandchildren tear each other apart for a decade. Mountains she had birthed were now rubble. Valleys she had carved were filled with divine corpses. Rivers she had nursed ran gold with Ichor instead of water. When Zeus came to her speaking of peace, she wanted to believe him. Perhaps that desire made her blind to the deception flowering in her grandson's heart like a poisonous bloom. The Peace Summit was arranged for the spring equinox, when day and night stood in perfect balance. The location was neutral ground, an island that existed outside both Titan and Olympian territory, created specifically for this meeting by combining divine powers. Both armies would send representatives, weapons would be forbidden, oaths would be sworn on the sticks, making them unbreakable even by gods. Everything was structured to ensure good faith negotiation. Zeus selected his delegation carefully. Athena for wisdom, Apollo for truth, Hestia for peace. Each god chosen to project sincerity and exhaustion with war. Kronos brought Atlas for strength, Themis for justice, Prometheus for foresight, though his vision remained clouded from previous punishment. The delegations met at dawn, their first civil interaction in a decade. The negotiations lasted 3 days. Terms were discussed with surprising honesty. The Titans would retain control of certain domains but acknowledge Olympian sovereignty. The Olympians would rule the mortal realm but respect Titan authority in cosmic matters. Prisoners would be exchanged. The dead would be honored. The weapons of mass destruction both sides had developed would be destroyed or sealed. It was not perfect peace, but it was peace, and after 10 years of apocalyptic war, that seemed miracle enough. On the third evening, as final terms were being drafted, Zeus made his move. Hidden in his delegation were the 3 Hecatonchires, not physically present, but bound into spatial pockets, folded spaces no larger than coins that Zeus carried. At his signal, these pockets inverted, releasing the 100-handed ones directly into the negotiation chamber. The surprise was absolute. The betrayal was perfect. But the true betrayal was not the ambush itself, but what Zeus had done to ensure its success. He had sworn his oaths of peace on a false Styx, a replica river created by Poseidon that looked and felt identical but carried no binding power. Every promise he had made was worthless. Every guarantee was hollow. The Titans had been negotiating with a facade, while Zeus positioned his forces for the war's final battle. Kronos' realization transformed his face from hope to horror to rage in seconds that stretched like hours. He reached for his scythe, only to remember he had left it behind as a gesture of good faith. Atlas moved to attack, but found himself wrapped in chains that Hephaestus had hidden in the island's foundation, activated by Zeus's betrayal. Prometheus tried to warn them, his foresight finally clearing, but too late, always too late. The Hecatonchires did not kill the Titan delegates. That would have been merciful. Instead, they systematically broke them, bones shattered in specific sequences that would heal wrong, tendons severed in patterns that would leave gods crippled even after regeneration. Divine essence itself cracked like glass, creating wounds that would never fully close. The torture was precise, calculated to create maximum suffering while keeping victims conscious. The Ms, goddess of justice, received the worst treatment. Zeus personally oversaw her breaking, punishing her for maintaining neutrality, for trying to be fair, for representing the order he was about to overthrow. He forced her to watch as he rewrote divine law, making his betrayal retroactively legal, transforming her concept of justice into whatever served Olympian interest. Her screams created the first echoes, sounds that bounce forever, carrying her agony through time. The signal of betrayal triggered coordinated attacks across all fronts. Olympian forces, supposedly maintaining ceasefire, struck at relaxed Titan positions. The surprise was total. Defenses were down, weapons were stored, soldiers were celebrating preliminary peace. The slaughter that followed made previous battles look like formal duels. This was not war, but extermination executed with precision planned for months. Hyperion fell first among the major Titans, caught observing the sunrise he thought would herald peace. Apollo's arrows, guided by prophecy and powered by betrayal, pierced his eyes simultaneously, destroying his ability to see across dimensions. Blind and disoriented, he was easy prey for Artemis's hunters, who brought him down like a cosmic stag, their spears finding every weak point in his luminous armor. Oceanus, the eldest Titan, tried to maintain neutrality, even as betrayal unfolded around him. He withdrew his waters from the conflict, creating temporary deserts rather than choose sides. Poseidon followed him into the oceanic depths, not to fight, but to negotiate. The conversation that followed was not recorded, but Oceanus emerged allied with Olympus, his neutrality purchased with promises that Zeus would later honor only technically, giving Oceanus dominion over waters too deep for light, while Poseidon claimed everything else. The betrayal's most personal victim was Rhea, mother to both sides. She had believed her son's peace offer, had advocated for it with Kronos, had used maternal influence to make negotiation possible. When she learned of Zeus's deception, something broke in her that would never heal. She withdrew from both pantheons, retreating to places between places where neither Titan nor Olympian could follow. Her tears during this retreat created rain that lasted 40 days, flooding civilizations that had just begun recovering from the war. Kronos himself escaped the initial ambush through temporal manipulation, freezing time long enough to phase through his restraints, but he emerged into a world where his forces were already routed, his allies captured or turned, his strongholds falling to coordinated assault. The peace negotiation had been perfectly timed to coincide with Titan vulnerability. Guard rotations were at minimum. Defensive magic was powered down for maintenance. Supply lines were relaxed. Everything that made the Titans formidable had been temporarily suspended for peace that was never real. The hunt for Kronos became the war's final act. Zeus led it personally, wielding not just the master bolt, but weapons forged from the betrayal itself. Betrayal, he had learned, was power. It created a unique energy that could pierce any defense, break any shield, corrupt any loyalty. He had transformed his dishonor into armament, his lies into lightning, his deception into divine might. They cornered Kronos at the original site of Uranos's castration, the place where this cycle began. The location was not coincidental. Zeus wanted his father to understand that patterns repeated, that sons overthrew fathers, that time itself was circular, despite Kronos' mastery of it. The final battle was less combat than execution. Kronos weakened by betrayal, fighting Zeus empowered by it. But Kronos' last words before his defeat would prove prophetic. As Zeus raised the master bolt for the killing blow, Kronos spoke not in anger but in certainty. "You have become me," he said, his voice carrying across all dimensions simultaneously. "Every cruelty I committed you have exceeded. Every paranoia I suffered you will surpass. Every child you birth will be your potential destroyer, as you were mine, as I was my father's. The cycle continues, and your betrayal today ensures your own tomorrow." Zeus struck him down mid-sentence, but the words had been heard by everyone, recorded in the fabric of reality itself. The master bolt shattered Kronos into fragments of time, each piece experiencing different moments simultaneously. His consciousness was scattered across past, present, and future, existing everywhere and nowhere, defeated but not destroyed, imprisoned in temporal paradox that made coherent thought impossible. The other titans fell rapidly after their leader's defeat. Without Kronos' temporal powers supporting them, they were overwhelmed by Olympian forces still energized by successful betrayal. Iapetus was dragged to Tartarus in chains that burned with the heat of broken oaths. Kratos was compressed into a star and hung in the sky as warning. Coeus went mad from the contradiction of betrayed order and threw himself into the void rather than accept imprisonment. Atlas received special punishment for his military leadership. Zeus condemned him to hold the heavens forever, not as torture, but as irony. The Titan, who had nearly won the war through strength, would spend eternity using that strength in service of Olympian reality. His position at the world's western edge would remind all who saw him that Titan power now served Olympian will. The betrayal's aftermath was managed with brutal efficiency. Zeus declared amnesty for Titans, who surrendered immediately, then defined immediately as having happened yesterday, making surrender impossible for those who had not already submitted. He honored his promises to neutral parties by redefining neutrality as support, claiming those who had not fought against him had fought for him. Every oath he had sworn was kept in letter while being violated in spirit. Some Titans escaped imprisonment through Zeus's calculated mercy. Venus was released to serve as goddess of divine law, her broken sense of justice now aligned with Olympian definition. Mnemosyne was spared to become mother of the muses by Zeus, her memory selectively edited to forget the betrayal's worst aspects. Prometheus's punishment was delayed, his foresight too valuable to waste immediately. These survivals were not kindness but strategy, keeping useful Titans while eliminating threats. The victory celebration on Olympus was muted by the means of achievement. Even gods who had supported Zeus recognized that something fundamental had changed. Victory through betrayal was still victory, but it tasted different from triumph through strength or strategy. The Olympians had won by becoming what they had fought against, perhaps worse. The moral high ground they had claimed was revealed as mountain of lies built on foundation of deception. Hestia refused to attend the victory feast, maintaining her hearth, but declining to celebrate. Her absence spoke louder than any condemnation. Hades took his portion of victory, the underworld, and immediately departed, wanting distance from his brother's methods. Even Hera, who would become Zeus's wife and queen, looked at him differently, seeing not the liberator who had freed them from Kronos' stomach, but the deceiver who had won through dishonor. The great betrayal succeeded in ending the Titanomachy, but it also ended something else. The age when gods could be trusted, when divine word meant something, when immortals were assumed to be above mortal failings. Zeus had proven that gods could lie as effectively as any human, betray as thoroughly as any mortal, justify any atrocity as necessary for greater good that looked suspiciously like personal benefit. The pattern was set, the methodology was established, the precedent was created. From this moment forward, Greek mythology would be characterized by divine betrayal, by gods breaking oaths, by immortals treating their word as weapons rather than bonds. Every future tragedy, every cursed bloodline, every hero's downfall could trace its roots back to this moment when Zeus chose betrayal over honor and reshaped divine nature in his own corrupted image. The immediate aftermath of Zeus's betrayal triggered a cascade of consequences that neither victor nor vanquished had anticipated. Reality itself began rejecting what had occurred, like an immune system responding to infection. The cosmic order that had maintained existence since creation started failing, not dramatically but incrementally, each small breakdown contributing to an accelerating collapse that would define the new age of gods. The first sign was the sun refusing to rise properly. Helios, the titan who drove the solar chariot, was technically neutral but practically imprisoned. His horses, sensing their master's distress, would not run their proper course. Dawn arrived hours late, noon struck at random times, and sunset sometimes lasted days. Apollo attempted to take over the duty, but the solar horses recognized him as an usurper, fighting his control, causing the sun to zigzag across the sky in patterns that scorched some regions while leaving others in permanent twilight. The seasonal order collapsed next. The Horae, goddesses of the seasons, could not reconcile the betrayal with their nature as embodiments of proper time and sequence. Spring arrived in winter's middle, autumn interrupted summer, and sometimes all four seasons occurred simultaneously in different parts of the same region. Crops failed from confusion. Animals forgot migration patterns. The natural world that had survived 10 years of war began dying from cosmic inconsistency. On Olympus, the victory Zeus had achieved through betrayal began eating itself. The gods who had supported him now wondered when he would betray them. Every council meeting became an exercise in paranoia, with gods attending in full armor, hands on weapons, magic defenses active. Alliance meant nothing if oaths could be sworn on false rivers. Trust became impossible when the king of gods had proven himself the lord of lies. Oreas was the first to crack under the new reality. The god of war had thrived during conflict, but found peace unbearable, especially peace achieved through dishonor. He began starting conflicts randomly, appearing in mortal cities to inspire violence, turning peaceful gatherings into bloodbaths. When Zeus ordered him to stop, Ares laughed and asked which Zeus was speaking, the one who swore peace or the one who broke it, the one who claimed justice or the one who betrayed it. The question went unanswered, but Ares' rebellion continued. The Titans in Tartarus were not passive prisoners. Their rage at the betrayal gave them power that mere defeat never could have. They began singing in harmony, their voices combining into frequencies that resonated with creation's fundamental structure. These songs did not break their chains, but they weakened reality around them. Tartarus, designed as absolute prison, began leaking, not enough for Titans to escape, but sufficient for their influence to seep into the world above. This influence manifested as corruption in newborns. Children began being born wrong, not physically, but spiritually. They would age backwards, remember futures that would not happen, speak languages that had never existed. Some were born already dead, yet continued growing. Others were born ancient and grew younger. The fundamental order of life was breaking down, and no god had power to fix it, because the betrayal had broken the very concept of natural order. Demeter's response to the chaos was withdrawal. She abandoned her duties entirely, leaving harvests to rot and seeds to remain dormant. Her grief was not just for the war, but for what victory had cost. She had fought for a better world and received one where betrayal was rewarded and honor punished. Her absence created the first true famine, affecting even divine realms, where ambrosia grew scarce and nectar soured. The underworld experienced its own collapse. The massive influx of divine dead from the war's end overwhelmed Hades's nascent infrastructure. Souls piled up at the Styx with no ferrymen to transport them. The dead wandered between life and death, neither fully in one state nor the other. Some possessed the living, others simply stood at crossroads, visible but intangible, reminders of the war's cost that would not go away. Poseidon discovered that the seas themselves were dying. The betrayal had poisoned water at a conceptual level. Oceanus's forced alliance had split the ocean's loyalty, creating currents that fought each other, tides that flowed in impossible directions, depths that led not down but sideways into spaces that should not exist. Sea creatures began evolving rapidly and randomly, some developing consciousness just long enough to curse the gods before dying. On Olympus, Zeus's paranoia reached levels that exceeded even Kronos's worst moments. He began seeing threats everywhere, not without justification. Several minor coup attempts were discovered and brutally suppressed. He created a secret police of wind spirits who reported private conversations. He instituted loyalty oaths that had to be renewed daily, sworn on the real Styx this time, binding gods to him through fear rather than respect. Hera's transformation during this period was particularly tragic. She had loved Zeus once, seen in him the promise of better rulership. Now she watched him become everything they had fought against. Her love curdled into something else. Not quite hate, but certainly not affection. She began taking lovers simply to hurt him, then punishing the lovers for accepting her advances. Her marriage to Zeus became the template for divine dysfunction that would characterize Olympian relationships forever. The Muses, born from Zeus and Mnemosyne during this period, emerged already broken. They were supposed to inspire art and culture, but what they inspired was dark and twisted. Epic poems about the war portrayed betrayal as virtue. Songs celebrated deception. Dances mimicked the movements of dying gods. The art of this era was technically brilliant, but spiritually poisonous, spreading the corruption of the war's end through cultural means. Hephaestus threw himself into creating devices that could fix the broken reality, machines that could force order onto chaos. But each solution created new problems. His device to regulate the sun's movement caused the moon to rebel. His mechanism to control the seasons disrupted the tides. His attempt to stabilize time created pockets of temporal variance where past and future collided. The god of the forge learned that some things, once broken, could not be fixed through craft alone. The giants, children of Gaia, born from Uranus's spilled blood, began stirring in their prisons. They sensed the weakness in the new divine order, recognized that gods who had won through betrayal would struggle against enemies who fought with honest rage. Gaia herself, horrified by Zeus's deception at the peace summit, began planning the Gigantomachy, the next war that would challenge Olympian rule. She would not make the same mistake twice of trusting Zeus's words. Communications between gods became nearly impossible. Every message was assumed to be deception. Every invitation was potential ambush. Every gift was possible poison. The divine court that Zeus had envisioned as organized and hierarchical became a nest of suspicion, where gods attended only when commanded and left as quickly as possible. The isolation that resulted meant problems were not shared until they became crises. The mortal world reflected divine dysfunction in miniature. Cities that had worshipped different gods went to war over theological differences that were really about divine politics. Families split based on which gods they honored. The concept of justice became so confused that legal systems collapsed, replaced by might makes right paradigms that mirrored Zeus's betrayal. Civilization itself began regressing, not from external pressure, but from internal contradiction. Even victory celebrations became occasions for conflict. The first Olympic Games, meant to honor Zeus's triumph, devolved into actual combat when divine spectators began fighting over interpretations of events. The games had to be suspended when Ares killed 3 minor gods who suggested his performance in the war had been inadequate. The celebration of victory became another battlefield, proving that the war had not really ended but only changed form. The natural world showed increasing signs of rejection. Earthquakes happened without cause. Volcanoes erupted in places with no geological activity. Weather patterns became completely unpredictable, with snow in deserts and heat waves in polar regions. The Earth itself, Gaia's body, was rebelling against what had been done upon it. Some regions became uninhabitable, not from divine curse, but from reality's breakdown. Animals began behaving impossibly. Birds flew backwards. Fish walked on land. Predators became vegetarian, while herbivores developed taste for meat. The fundamental categories that organized life were dissolving. Some creatures simply stopped existing mid-movement, reality forgetting they were supposed to be. Others spontaneously generated from nothing, reality attempting to fill gaps it could not define. The fates themselves showed signs of strain. Clotho's thread of life became tangled beyond recognition. Lachesis could no longer measure lives that had no clear beginning or end. Atropos' shears grew dull from cutting through temporal paradoxes. The 3 sisters who were supposed to be above divine politics found themselves trying to maintain causality in a universe where cause and effect had been betrayed along with everything else. Language itself began breaking down. Words would change meaning mid-sentence. Names would be forgotten as they were spoken. Some gods found themselves unable to communicate except through violence, their ability to speak replaced by compulsion to strike. The Tower of Babel had not yet been built by mortals, but its divine equivalent was occurring naturally as communication failed across all levels. The death spiral accelerated when gods began forgetting their own natures. Hestia would forget to tend the hearth, causing divine homes to freeze. Hermes, not yet fully born, but partially existing, would forget messages mid-delivery. Athena would lose track of strategies mid-battle. The divine essence that gave gods their identity was being corroded by the contradiction between what they were supposed to be and what they had become. Even Zeus began showing signs of breakdown. He would forget which lies he had told to whom, creating contradictions that exposed his deceptions. His paranoia led him to suspect himself, creating shadow duplicates to spy on his own thoughts. He began sleeping with one eye open, then stopped sleeping entirely, maintained in wakefulness by ambrosia, mixed with stimulants that did not yet exist, but were pulled from potential futures. The Pantheon was dying not from external threat, but from internal contradiction. Victory achieved through betrayal was proving to be defeat in disguise. The Olympians ruled over a breaking world with broken spirits and broken trust. The Titans in Tartarus might have lost the war, but their prophecies of corruption were proving true. The cycle was continuing, but faster and more viciously than anyone had predicted. As the immediate aftermath of the war transformed into the new normal, one truth became undeniable. The Titanomachy had not ended with Zeus's victory. It had only transformed into a different kind of conflict, one where the enemies were not external threats, but internal contradictions, where the battlefield was reality itself, and where victory might be indistinguishable from defeat. The death spiral had begun, and even immortals could not see where it would end. The true end of the Titanomachy came not with Zeus's betrayal at the peace summit, but 3 months later, when the remaining Titans made their last stand at the edge of existence itself. This final battle would determine not just who ruled, but whether there would be anything left to rule. The location was the boundary between cosmos and chaos, where Gaia's body met the primordial void, a place where reality thinned to transparency, and gods could see through existence into the nothing that preceded everything. Kronos had reconstituted himself from temporal fragments through sheer will and the assistance of those Titans who had escaped the initial imprisonment. His form was different now, less solid deity than living paradox. He existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, his body flickering between youth and age, between whole and shattered, between defeated and victorious. Speaking to him required accepting that all conversations had already happened and would happen again, that every word was prophecy and history combined. The Titan forces were fewer but more desperate. Atlas had escaped his mountain prison through strength that surprised even himself, motivated by rage that transformed physical laws into suggestions. Hyperion had regenerated his eyes through concentrated stellar energy, though what he now saw drove him partially mad, as he perceived every spectrum of reality overlapping in nauseating complexity. Iapetus wielded weapons forged from compressed entropy, devices that did not destroy but uncreated, removing targets from having existed. They were joined by creatures that should not have been, entities pulled from aborted timelines, and cancelled futures by Kronos' temporal mastery. These were gods that would never be born, heroes from stories that would never be told, monsters from nightmares that would never be dreamed. Their very presence made reality uncertain, as existence tried to reconcile beings that simultaneously should and should not be. Zeus assembled every Olympian and ally for this confrontation, understanding that failure here would mean more than defeat. If Kronos succeeded in unraveling time at reality's edge, everything that had happened could be undone. The entire war might be erased, the Olympians never born, existence itself revised according to Titan will. The stakes transcended victory or defeat and entered the realm of whether there would be a realm at all. The battle began not with charges or war cries, but with reality itself groaning under the strain of so many divine powers concentrated in space, already weakened by its proximity to void. The ground, if it could be called ground, existed in states of constant transformation, solid to liquid, to gas to concept to nothing, and back again. The sky was all colors and no colors simultaneously, a paradox that hurt even divine eyes to perceive. Zeus struck first with lightning that existed across all timelines. Bolts that had struck were striking and would strike all at once. Kronos caught them with hands that aged the electricity through its entire existence instantly, from the first spark to the last electron, nullifying the attack by making it have already happened long ago. Their duel was less combat than competitive revision of reality, each trying to impose their version of events on existence. Atlas engaged the Hecatonchires in combat that redefined the concept of strength. Mountains thrown by 100 hands met fists that could shatter concepts. The impact of their confrontation created gravitational anomalies that still exist, black holes that swallow light not through mass but through compressed violence. Atlas fought with the desperation of someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to lose, a freedom that made him more dangerous than he had ever been as a general. Hyperion's assault was everywhere at once, light weaponized into forms that had no names because they had never existed before, solid photons that cut through divine flesh, darkness visible that blinded by its presence rather than absence, colors beyond spectrum that communicated concepts directly into consciousness, bypassing thought to plant ideas like weapons in enemy minds. Apollo and Artemis, working in perfect twin synchronization, could barely contain him. Their own mastery of light and hunt combined, struggling against the primordial titan of illumination. The battlefield expanded beyond physical space into conceptual realms. Gods fought in dimensions of pure thought, where weapons were arguments and shields were certainties. They battled through probability streams, each trying to make their victory more likely than their defeat. The combat occurred in the past, present, and future simultaneously, creating causality loops where effects preceded causes and consequences determined their own origins. Prometheus, despite his Olympian allegiance, found himself paralyzed by foresight that showed every possible outcome occurring at once. He stood frozen as infinite versions of the battle played out in his perception, unable to act because every action led to contradictory results. His brother Epimetheus tried to shake him free, but touching Prometheus meant experiencing the same overwhelming possibility, leaving both brothers locked in prophetic paralysis. The void itself began participating, not taking sides but feeding on the conflict. Each divine blow that missed its target continued into nothingness and was absorbed, making the void stronger, more present, more capable of intruding into existence. Cracks appeared in reality's fabric, through which absolute nothing leaked, dissolving anything it touched into component impossibilities. Gaia made her final choice in this moment, not supporting either side but trying to preserve existence itself. The Earth Mother manifested not as goddess, but as concept, as the fundamental idea of substance and form. She positioned herself between the combatants and the void, absorbing attacks that would have torn reality apart, suffering wounds that appeared as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions across every world that had Earth. The revelation that changed everything came when Metis, thought to be devoured by Zeus to prevent their child from overthrowing him, spoke from inside his consciousness. She had not been destroyed, but incorporated. And from within Zeus's mind, she could see truths he could not. She revealed that this battle was not the end, but the beginning, that every blow struck here created ripples that would become future conflicts, that the violence they were committing was seeding every tragedy that would follow. Zeus heard her words, and for one moment, just one, hesitated. In that hesitation, Kronos struck with everything he had, not with scythe or temporal power, but with truth. He showed Zeus his future, the paranoid tyrant he would become, the rapist and abuser, the god so feared that mortals would celebrate when a scarred Spartan finally ended his reign. He showed Zeus that victory here meant becoming everything they had fought against, but worse, because at least Kronos had begun noble before fear corrupted him. The vision should have destroyed Zeus's will to fight. Instead, it enraged him beyond divine comprehension. He attacked not Kronos, but the future itself, striking at time with lightning that tried to burn away destiny. The paradox of attempting to destroy what had not yet happened while standing in a place where everything happened simultaneously created an explosion of causality that shattered the battlefield into infinite fragments. In that shattering, something unprecedented occurred. All combatants experienced every possible version of the battle's end simultaneously. They felt themselves winning and losing, living and dying, ascending and falling all at once. The overload of contradictory experience forced a collective realization that continuing meant mutual annihilation not just of themselves, but of the concept of existence. The fighting stopped not through victory or surrender, but through exhaustion of possibility itself. There were no more moves to make that had not already been made in some timeline. No more strategies to employ that had not already failed and succeeded simultaneously. The battle had reached a stalemate, not of strength, but of paradox, where every action had already been countered by its own consequence. Kronos spoke first in the stillness that followed, his voice carrying the weight of every moment that had ever been. He acknowledged defeat, not because Zeus was stronger, but because the future had already happened, was happening, would happen regardless of present action. The circular nature of time meant that his overthrow was not just prophesied, but had already occurred from perspective of future looking back. Fighting against what had already happened was futile, even for the Lord of Time. Zeus accepted the victory with none of the triumph he had anticipated. He understood now what rulership meant. Not glory, but responsibility for every tragedy that would unfold from this moment. Every rape he would commit was already victim's memory. Every bastard child he would father was already born. Every hero who would suffer from his petty vengeance was already suffering. He was not becoming king, but accepting a role that included being the villain in countless stories. The formal surrender was conducted with exhausted ceremony. Kronos and the remaining Titans agreed to imprisonment, not because they were defeated, but because the alternative was the complete unraveling of existence. They would go to Tartarus not as prisoners, but as pillars, their presence necessary to maintain the cosmic order even in chains. Their suffering would be the foundation upon which Olympian rule rested, a fundamental injustice that would corrupt everything built upon it. Atlas received his famous punishment here, condemned to hold the heavens not as torture, but as necessity. Someone had to maintain the separation between order and chaos, and his strength made him the only candidate. His positioning at the western edge of the world was strategic, a barrier between existence and the void that had grown stronger during the battle. Every moment of his suffering was a moment reality continued to exist. The Hecatonchires were assigned as guards not to prevent Titan escape, but to prevent reality from collapsing into Tartarus. Their 100 hands would eternally shore up the boundaries between imprisonment and existence, their vigilance the only thing preventing the cosmic equivalent of a black hole from consuming everything. They accepted this duty with the grim satisfaction of those who understood necessity without enjoying it. As the participants departed the battlefield that existed nowhere and everywhere, they left behind more than memory. The location where the final battle occurred became a permanent wound in reality, a place where time and space remained uncertain, where possibility and impossibility mingled freely. It would later be known by many names across many cultures, always described as the place where the world ended and began, where gods learned they were not omnipotent, but merely powerful enough to destroy everything including themselves. The final battle's true conclusion was not victory or defeat, but exhausted acceptance of a broken status quo. The Olympians would rule because someone had to. The Titans would be imprisoned because the alternative was worse. Reality would continue because even gods feared the alternative. The war was over not because peace was achieved, but because continuation meant annihilation. Every tragedy in Greek mythology that followed could trace its roots to this moment, when gods accepted victory that tasted like defeat, when power was revealed as burden, when immortality meant eternal responsibility for consequences that could never be undone. The Titanomachy ended not with triumph, but with the terrible understanding that winning and losing were merely different perspectives on the same catastrophe. The silence that followed the Titanomachy's end was not peaceful, but pregnant with consequences yet to unfold. Mount Olympus, now the undisputed seat of divine power, bore no resemblance to the paradise its new rulers had envisioned. The palace walls were built from compressed battlefield dust, mixed with ichor of both allies and enemies. The throne room's pillars were carved from bones of concepts that had died during the war, abstract ideas like mercy and trust that had been casualties as real as any fallen god. Zeus's throne itself was forged from the melted remains of weapons that had killed immortals, a seat that burned with the memory of divine murder. The immediate challenge was establishing order in a cosmos that had forgotten what order meant. The 10-year war had not just killed gods, but had murdered the systems that maintained reality. The position of psychopomp, guide of dead souls, did not exist because death had become so common it needed no guide. The concept of justice had been fractured into competing definitions that contradicted each other. Even basic functions like the progression of time or the solidity of matter required constant divine maintenance to prevent them from reverting to wartime chaos. Zeus's first act as king was to divide the cosmos among the victors, but this division was less gift than burden assignment. Poseidon received the seas, but they were seas poisoned with divine blood, where currents fought themselves and depths led to dimensions that should not exist. Hades inherited the underworld, but it was an underworld overflowing with unprocessed dead, where the infrastructure for judgment and punishment had yet to be invented. Zeus kept the sky and earth, but they were sky torn with reality wounds, and earth scarred with battles that had changed geography into geology's nightmare. The mortal world had survived, but barely. Human population had been reduced by 90%, not all from direct divine action, but from the cascade of consequences. When gods who maintained natural order fought, nature became unnatural. Seasons had occurred randomly, causing crops to fail and succeed simultaneously. Rivers had flowed upward, stranding settlements. Mountains had migrated, crushing cities that had existed in their path for millennia. The survivors were not the strongest but the luckiest, those who happened to be in places where reality remained relatively stable. These surviving mortals presented an unexpected problem. They had witnessed gods at their absolute worst, seen divine nature stripped of dignity and revealed as petty violence. The automatic worship that had preceded the war was gone, replaced by fear tinged with disgust. Prayers, when they came, were not praise but pleading for gods to simply leave mortals alone. The Olympians had won the war, but lost the automatic reverence that previous generations of gods had enjoyed. Demeter's first harvest after the war produced grain that carried memories of divine blood in its genetic structure. Bread made from this grain would cause those who ate it to experience fragments of the war, to taste the fear of dying gods, to feel the weight of Titan chains. She spent years trying to purify the harvest, to grow food that did not carry trauma in its nutrition. Her failure to completely succeed meant that all subsequent human generations would carry subtle cellular memory of divine violence, an inheritance that would manifest as inexplicable fears and sudden violences. The establishment of new divine positions revealed the scope of what had been broken. Hermes was born to be messenger god, but his first message delivery resulted in 3 separate wars because language had become unreliable during the Titanomachy. Words meant different things to different gods based on their war experience. Peace could mean surrender or victory or the pause between battles. Justice might mean revenge or balance or whatever the speaker wanted. Communication required not just messenger but translator, interpreter, and sometimes mediator to prevent misunderstandings from becoming conflicts. Dionysus's birth was itself an aftermath event. Zeus had impregnated Semele, but their child could not be born normally because normal had ceased to exist. When Semele died, from seeing Zeus's true form, he had to sew the fetal god into his own thigh, creating the first divine pregnancy that was also self-surgery. Dionysus emerged not as infant, but as concept of intoxication-seeking form, his very existence a method for both gods and mortals to forget what they had witnessed during the war. The psychological damage to the Olympians manifested in their domains. Ares had become god of war, but his understanding of war had been shaped by the Titanomachy's extremes. He could not comprehend honorable combat or strategic warfare, only the total annihilation he had witnessed. His blessing on mortal conflicts transformed skirmishes into genocides, territorial disputes into extinction events. Other gods had to actively counteract his influence to prevent humanity from destroying itself through warfare that mimicked divine example. Aphrodite, born from violence when Kronos was castrated, found her domain of love corrupted by the war's betrayals. Love became possessive, jealous, capable of inspiring violence equal to any hatred. Her affairs with various gods were less romance than attempts to find connection that was not tainted by suspicion. to experience intimacy that did not carry the possibility of betrayal. Her failure to find such pure connection meant that love itself became unreliable, as likely to destroy as create. The Titans in Tartarus were not passive prisoners, but active forces of corruption. Their presence in the cosmic basement poisoned the foundation of reality. Their dreams leaked upward, influencing the world above in subtle ways. Architecture would occasionally build itself according to Titan aesthetics. Laws would sometimes enforce themselves according to pre-war standards. The past kept trying to reassert itself through imprisoned gods who refused to accept their obsolescence. Prometheus's punishment became the aftermath's most visible symbol. Chained to his rock, with an eagle eating his regenerating liver daily, he served as reminder of the price of defying Zeus. But the punishment was also confession, acknowledgement that the Olympian order required such visible cruelty to maintain itself. Every day, gods and mortals could witness divine justice, which looked remarkably like divine sadism. The screams from his mountain became part of the world's ambient sound, background noise to civilization. The creation of new humans became necessary as the war-surviving population proved too traumatized to thrive. But Prometheus and Epimetheus, tasked with this creation, could only work with materials available. Clay mixed with divine blood from battlefields, animated with breath that carried war's memory. These new humans were stronger than their predecessors, but also more violent, more capable of both creation and destruction. They inherited not innocence, but the capacity for both divine nobility and divine cruelty. The establishment of mystery cults during this period was direct response to the war's revelations. Mortals had seen too much, understood that gods were not worthy of blind worship. The mysteries offered alternative narratives, secret truths that suggested the war had been necessary transformation, that suffering had meaning, that destruction preceded rebirth. These cults provided psychological framework for processing trauma that conventional religion could not address. Marriage between Zeus and Hera was meant to symbolize new stability, but their union was foundation built on quicksand. Hera had seen Zeus's capacity for betrayal, knew that his promises meant nothing. Their wedding night was less consummation than negotiation, establishing rules for a relationship where trust was impossible. Their constant conflicts, Zeus's infidelities, Hera's vengeful responses, all stemmed from this foundational inability to believe in each other's good faith. The judgment of Paris, still far in the future, was already being seeded by aftermath dynamics. The golden apple of discord that would spark the Trojan War was conceptually created by the divisions and resentments established in the war's wake. Every competitive conflict between goddesses, every divine vanity, every petty jealousy that would culminate in Troy's destruction had its origin in insecurities and injuries sustained during the Titanomachy. New monsters began appearing, not created by gods, but generated spontaneously from reality's wounds. The Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, the Stymphalian birds, all emerged from places where divine violence had been most intense. They were not designed but evolved. Reality's attempt to process trauma by manifesting it as creatures that embodied specific aspects of the war. Heroes would later fight these monsters, but they were really fighting crystallized memories of divine conflict. The establishment of fate as force beyond divine control was aftermath necessity. The fates had to be placed above even Zeus to prevent the arbitrary revision of reality that had characterized the war. Destiny became fixed, not because it always had been, but because the alternative was chaos. The threads of fate that would bind all future mythology were woven from necessity to prevent gods from unmaking consequences they disliked. Communication with other pantheons ceased entirely. The Egyptian gods reinforced their barriers, making their realm completely inaccessible to Greek deities. The Norse gods accelerated their own prophesied doom, preferring known ending to Greek uncertainty. Eastern pantheons developed elaborate protocols to prevent Greek divine influence from spreading. The Titanomachy had made Greek gods pariahs in the cosmic community, too dangerous to interact with safely. Even celebration became impossible in traditional terms. Attempts at festivals would devolve into competitions that recalled war rivalries. Music reminded listeners of battle sounds. Dancing mimicked combat movements. Food tasted of offerings made for divine favor during desperate battles. The Olympians could not celebrate their victory without remembering its cost, could not enjoy peace without recalling how it was achieved. The infrastructure of divine rule had to be built from nothing, as previous systems had been destroyed. Courts had to be established to adjudicate disputes between gods who trusted no one. Laws had to be written in languages that could not be misinterpreted. Punishments had to be created that could affect immortals who could not die. The bureaucracy of Olympus became elaborate, not from desire for complexity, but from necessity to prevent misunderstandings from becoming wars. As the immediate aftermath stabilized into new normal, a pattern emerged that would define Greek mythology forever. Every solution created new problems. Every attempt at order generated chaos. Every effort to forget the war ensured it would be remembered. The Olympians ruled not through divine right, but through exhausted default, maintaining power, because the alternative had been demonstrated to be worse. The aftermath was not transition but transformation. The cosmos that emerged from the Titanomachy bore only superficial resemblance to what had existed before. Gods were still immortal, but now knew immortality could be worse than death. Power still existed, but was recognized as burden rather than blessing. Order was maintained but only through constant effort against entropy that the war had accelerated. The seeds of every future tragedy were planted in this aftermath soil. The arrogance that would lead Zeus to challenge Kratos. The paranoia that would make Hera torture innocent women. The dysfunction that would characterize every divine relationship. All of it grew from the poisoned ground of the Titanomachy's end, where victory and defeat had proven to be the same thing viewed from different angles, and where gods learned that winning a war could mean losing everything worth fighting for. The Titanomachy did not end 10 years after it began. It never ended at all. Every subsequent moment in Greek mythology was merely another reverberation of that primordial conflict, each divine tragedy, an echo of the original sin of sons, overthrowing fathers through violence and betrayal. The war had not resolved the fundamental tensions that caused it, but had instead encoded them into the very structure of reality, ensuring they would replay in infinite variations across infinite time. Zeus's paranoia about his own children manifested before they were even conceived. Every prophecy about offspring who might challenge him was simultaneously past, present, and future. When he swallowed Metis while she was pregnant with Athena, he was not just preventing a specific threat, but attempting to break the cycle that had defined his lineage. Yet the act itself perpetuated that cycle, proving that he had learned from Kronos not how to avoid his fate, but how to repeat it with variations. Athena's birth, erupting from Zeus's skull after Hephaestus split it with an axe, was the war's consequence made literal. She emerged fully grown and armed, wisdom born from violence, strategy birthed through pain. Her very existence was reminder that even thoughts could not be trusted, that ideas themselves could become weapons, that the mind which conceived betrayal could birth its own destruction. She would become goddess of both wisdom and warfare, the combination that had won the Titanomachy and would characterize all future Greek conflicts. The curse of the house of Atreus, though generations away, was already implicit in the divine example set by the Titanomachy. Families devouring themselves, children murdering parents, brothers betraying brothers. These were not human innovations, but divine patterns humans would unconsciously mirror. When Tantalus would later serve his son Pelops to the gods as dinner, he was merely recreating Kronos' consumption of his children. When Atreus would feed the Estes his own sons, he was following divine precedent. The mythology was teaching mortals that family was battlefield, that blood relation meant blood spilled. Every hero's journey that would follow carried the Titanomachy structure within it, a powerful establishment that seemed invincible, a young challenger who gathered unlikely allies, the discovery of the establishment's hidden weakness, victory achieved through combination of strength and cunning, usually including some form of betrayal or deception. Perseus, Theseus, Jason, Heracles, all would unconsciously reenact Zeus's rise to power, their stories' variations on the theme of overthrowing what came before through violence justified as liberation. The concept of hubris that would destroy so many Greek heroes was itself consequence of the war. Gods knew from experience that power corrupted, that victory led to arrogance, that strength became tyranny. They punished mortal hubris not from wisdom, but from recognition, seeing in human arrogance the same pride that had led to divine catastrophe. Every mortal struck down for overreach was proxy punishment for divine sins that could never be adequately addressed. The sexual violence that would characterize Zeus's reign was not separate from the war, but its continuation by other means. Rape became another form of conquest, bodies treated as territories to be claimed. The countless mortals and nymphs Zeus would assault were casualties of a war that had taught him that power meant taking what you wanted, regardless of consent. His transformations into animals to accomplish these assaults showed that the war had erased the boundary between divine and bestial, that gods could become monsters while remaining gods. Hera's persecution of Zeus's victims was the war's betrayal playing out in miniature, repeatedly, eternally. Unable to punish Zeus directly for his infidelities, she targeted those with less power, perpetuating the cycle of the strong destroying the weak that the Titanomachy had established. Her transformation of Io into a cow, her driving Heracles mad to kill his own family, her countless acts of cruel revenge against innocent women, all were echoes of divine justice that was really divine vengeance, dressed in righteousness's clothing. The Trojan War, the Iliad and Odyssey, were not separate stories, but chapters in the Titanomachy's extended epilogue, the gods taking sides, using mortals as proxies, being willing to see cities burned and nations destroyed over personal slights. This was the war's methodology transmitted to human scale. Achilles' rage was Ares' rage diluted but not diminished. Odysseus's cunning was Zeus's betrayal translated to mortal capability. Troy's fall was Othrys's fall, reenacted with humans playing divine roles. The mystery religions that flourished were attempts to find meaning in meaningless violence, to retroactively impose purpose on purposeless destruction. The Eleusinian mysteries' promise of blessed afterlife was compensation for life under gods who had proven themselves monsters. The Orphic mysteries' emphasis on purification was recognition that existence itself had been contaminated by divine violence. The Dionysian mysteries' ecstatic intoxication was escape from reality that had become unbearable while sober. Every cursed bloodline in Greek mythology traced its curse to some echo of the Titanomachy. The curse of Cadmus's line came from killing a dragon sacred to Ares, but Ares himself had become god of war through participation in patricidal conflict. The curse of the Labdacids that would destroy Oedipus stemmed from crimes that paralleled divine crimes, incest and patricide that gods had committed but mortals were punished for. Justice was not blind, but selectively sighted, seeing mortal sins while ignoring divine ones. The monsters that heroes would fight were not separate from the war, but its offspring. The Hydra's regenerating heads were the war's inability to truly end, each resolution creating new conflicts. The Minotaur in its labyrinth was divine shame hidden away but never destroyed, fed with human sacrifice to keep it contained. Medusa's gaze that turned viewers to stone was the paralysis of seeing divine truth too clearly, the horror of understanding what gods really were. Prometheus's eternal torture became the template for all divine punishments, not just consequence, but performance. Sisyphus rolling his boulder, Tantalus reaching for fruit, Ixion spinning on his wheel, all were variations on the theme of eternal suffering as spectacle. The punishments were not proportional to crimes, but proportional to divine need to demonstrate power through cruelty. Tartarus became theater, where divine justice performed itself for an audience of frightened mortals and gods. The gradual decline of divine power that would eventually lead to the gods' disappearance from active intervention was not external defeat but internal exhaustion. Each generation of gods was weaker than the previous, not physically but morally, spiritually, essentially. The Titanomachy had broken something fundamental about divinity. Gods could no longer believe in their own righteousness, could no longer maintain the illusion of deserving worship. They withdrew not because they were forced out, but because they could no longer bear being what they had become. The prophecy of the marked warrior who would destroy Olympus was not future prediction, but inevitable consequence. Kratos was not possibility, but certainty, created by the very actions Zeus took to prevent him. Every child Zeus killed fearing prophecy, every family he destroyed preventing challenge, every cruelty he committed maintaining power, all were building the rage that would eventually manifest as the ghost of Sparta. The Titanomachy had taught that fathers would be overthrown by sons, and in trying to prevent this, Zeus ensured it. The concept of fate itself was consequence of the war. Before the Titanomachy, future had been possibility. After it, future became fate, locked into patterns that would repeat regardless of action taken to prevent them. The fates were not causes, but symptoms, manifestations of reality's recognition that certain patterns had become too fundamental to escape. Every prophecy was not prediction, but observation of patterns established by the war that nothing could break. Cultural transmission of trauma through mythology meant every Greek child grew up knowing that power corrupted, that family was danger, that gods were threats rather than protectors. The stories they heard were not entertainment, but education in inevitable disappointment, preparation for world where justice was myth and power was reality. The Titanomachy had poisoned the cultural well, ensuring each generation would inherit not just stories, but the trauma those stories encoded. The very language of Greek mythology carried the war's influence. Words for divine concepts were inseparable from words for violence. Kratos meant strength, but also force. Baia meant might, but also violence. Nike meant victory, but also domination. The vocabulary itself ensured that discussing gods meant discussing conflict, that theology was inseparable from war. Language became vehicle for transmitting the Titanomachy's violence through time. Even geography bore eternal consequences. Places where major battles had occurred became permanently altered. Thin spaces where divine violence had worn reality threadbare. Delphi's oracle spoke truth because reality was uncertain there. Multiple possibilities coexisting. Mount Olympus remained shrouded in clouds, not from altitude, but from divine desire to hide what they had become. The underworld's rivers, Styx, Lethe, Acheron, Cocytus, Phlegethon, were not natural features but wounds that would not heal, bleeding different aspects of divine trauma into eternal flow. The philosophical implications would resonate through Western thought forever. The question of whether might makes right was not abstract but concrete, answered by Zeus's victory through betrayal. The nature of justice became permanently problematic after gods demonstrated that justice was whatever those in power declared it to be. The relationship between fate and free will became paradoxical after gods who seemed to choose freely fulfilled prophecies that suggested they had no choice. As Greek civilization developed, it carried within its DNA the patterns of the Titanomachy. Democracy arose partly as reaction against divine tyranny, mortals attempting to create governance that avoided the concentration of power that had corrupted gods. Philosophy developed as attempt to find truth that was not dependent on force, wisdom that was not weaponized. knowledge that could exist without becoming tool of domination. Yet even these innovations carried the war's shadow: democracy executing Socrates, philosophy justifying slavery, knowledge becoming power, becoming corruption. The eternal consequences were not punishment for the war, but the war itself, continuing in different forms. Every betrayal between lovers was Zeus and Hera. Every family tragedy was Kronos and his children. Every hero's rise and fall was the Titanomachy in miniature. The war had not ended, but had become the template for all conflicts. The pattern that would repeat until pattern recognition itself became mythology's primary theme. Stories about violence that could never be resolved, only transformed into new violences that would generate new stories, that would encode new traumas, that would echo forever. The greatest mystery of the Titanomachy was not how it ended, but why it had to happen again. Every pantheon that would rise after the Greeks would replay the same fundamental conflict, as if the war between Titans and Olympians had carved grooves into existence itself that all divine powers were doomed to follow. The Norse would have their Ragnarok, where Odin would face his own sons and giants in mutual annihilation. The Egyptians would see Set murder Osiris in divine fratricide. The Hindu pantheon would cycle through creation and destruction in endless repetition. The pattern was not coincidence, but cosmic law written in divine blood during those 10 years of Greek catastrophe. When Kratos eventually arrived, bearing the ashes of his family on his skin and rage that could crack mountains in his heart, he was not anomaly but inevitability. The ghost of Sparta was the Titanomachy's final echo, the last reverberation of that original conflict finally returning to its source. Every god he killed was paying for crimes committed during those 10 years of war. Zeus's death at his hands was not tragedy, but mathematics, the equation of patricide finally balancing after being left unsolved too long. The prophecy of the marked warrior had been misunderstood by Zeus and his fellow Olympians. They thought it referred to someone marked by tattoos or scars, hence their persecution of Deimos, Kratos' brother, who bore birthmarks they feared were the prophesied marks. But the real mark was not physical but spiritual. The ash of family murdered, the weight of guilt transformed into weapon. Kratos was marked not by birth, but by Zeus's own actions, created by the very paranoia meant to prevent him. Consider the perfect circularity of Kratos' vengeance. He used the blade of Olympus, Zeus's own weapon, to kill the god king. He freed the Titans from Tartarus to assault Olympus, reversing the Titanomachy's outcome. He employed betrayal and strategic deception, Zeus's own tactics turned against him. Every method Kratos used had been taught to him by the gods themselves, through their example. He was not their destroyer, but their student, applying lessons they had written in cosmos's fabric through their war. The opening of Pandora's box was not random plot device but necessary consequence of the Titanomachy. The evils released, greed, hatred, disease, were not foreign infections, but concentrated essences of what the war had already spread throughout existence. The box had been created to contain the war's spiritual pollution, the psychological and moral damage that could not be physically cleaned. When Kratos opened it seeking power to kill Ares, he was really releasing what had been trapped since the Titans fell, completing a process the war had started but never finished. Hope, the final content of Pandora's box, was the war's most mysterious legacy. Why would hope be stored with evils unless hope itself was evil, or unless the evils were somehow necessary for hope to exist? The answer lay in the Titanomachy's lesson that destruction preceded creation, that old orders had to fall for new ones to rise. Hope was not comfort but curse, the belief that things could improve that drove beings to destroy present for possibility of better future. Zeus had hoped to rule better than Kronos. Kronos had hoped to rule better than Uranos. Hope was the engine of eternal conflict. The mystery of why gods needed worship revealed itself through the war's aftermath. Divine power had been absolute before the Titanomachy, natural as breathing, but the war had wounded divinity itself, creating dependency on mortal belief to maintain coherence. Gods who had been self-sufficient became addicts to prayer, weakening when forgotten, strengthening when remembered. The war had transformed them from independent forces into parasites, feeding on mortal faith, explaining why they would fade as that faith diminished. Athena's evolution from Zeus's daughter to abstract force, guiding Kratos, represented divinity's attempt to transcend the patterns established by the Titanomachy. She recognized that physical godhood was trap, that having form meant being vulnerable to the cycle of violence. By becoming concept rather than character, wisdom rather than goddess of wisdom, she escaped the fate that claimed her family. Her ghostly guidance of Kratos was not manipulation but metamorphosis, showing that gods could evolve beyond the violence that created them. The spread of the Titanomachy's influence across pantheons raised questions about divine communication and contamination. Did gods of different cultures meet in spaces between mythologies to share stories? Did the violence of Greek gods infect other pantheons through some form of divine contact? Or was the pattern so fundamental that every group of gods independently discovered it, like mathematics being same across cultures because reality's rules were consistent? When Kratos traveled to the Norse lands, he carried the Titanomachy with him like disease. His presence would trigger Ragnarok early. His history would teach Atreus that gods could be killed. His example would inspire Thor to question Odin. The Greek war was not contained to Greece, but was virus spreading through divine populations, each pantheon falling to variations of the same conflict. Sons would overthrow fathers, brothers would betray brothers, power would corrupt absolutely, and mortals would suffer for divine dysfunction. The world serpent, Jormungandr, speaking to Kratos and Atreus from future, where he had already fought Thor at Ragnarok, demonstrated that the Titanomachy's temporal damage was not limited to Greek mythology. The war had broken time so thoroughly that effects could precede causes across pantheons. The serpent existed before his own birth because the Titanomachy had made such paradoxes possible, had weakened causality's rules enough that mythology could flow backward. Tyr's collection of artifacts from different pantheons in his vault suggested organized divine resistance to the Titanomachy's pattern. Here was God, who had studied the conflict's spread, who had tried to prevent its repetition, who had failed, but left evidence of his attempt. His absence, presumed death, implied that the pattern was stronger than individual divine will, that the war's influence was law rather than tendency. The prophecy of Loki bringing about Ragnarok through his children was Norse expression of Greek truth learned from the Titanomachy. Attempts to prevent prophecy ensured its fulfillment. Odin's persecution of Loki's children, imprisoning Fenrir, casting out Jormungandr, would create the very enemies who would destroy him. Every pantheon had to learn separately what Greeks had demonstrated, that divine paranoia was self-fulfilling prophecy. Why did every underworld in every mythology follow similar patterns? Rivers to cross, judges to face, punishments that fit crimes, rewards for virtue. These were not universal human imagination, but universal divine trauma from the Titanomachy. The war had established template for death that all pantheons unconsciously followed, creating underworlds that processed the dead through systems originally designed to handle divine casualties from the Greek conflict. The mystery of mortal heroes across cultures followed Titanomachy structure because the war had written the hero's journey into existence source code. Every culture's heroes faced impossible odds, gathered unlikely allies, discovered hidden powers, confronted corrupt authority, and achieved Pyrrhic victories, because these were the steps Zeus had taken to overthrow Kronos. Humanity had not invented the monomyth, but had inherited it from gods who had lived it. The question of whether gods could truly die was answered differently by the Titanomachy's beginning and end. Kronos had scattered, Ouranos. But the sky still existed. Zeus had shattered Kronos, but time still flowed. Perhaps gods could not die, but could be transformed into their functions. Consciousness dissolved into concept. The Titans had not been killed but had become the infrastructure of reality. Their imprisonment actually integration into cosmos's foundation. Modern disappearance of active gods might not be death, but evolution, transformation from persons into principles. Zeus became not god of thunder, but thunder itself. Poseidon dissolved into oceans. Hades merged with death. The Titanomachy had started process that took millennia to complete. The gradual transformation of anthropomorphic deities into natural forces, personality dissolving into physics. The survival of myths themselves was the war's strangest legacy. Why did stories of gods persist when gods themselves had vanished? Because the stories were more real than the gods, the patterns more permanent than the Pantheon. The Titanomachy had created narrative structures so fundamental that it outlived its creators. Stories that continued generating meaning after their subjects ceased to exist. Archaeological evidence supported mythological truth in unexpected ways. Ancient sites showed destruction layers corresponding to the war's timeline. Genetic bottlenecks in human population matched the claimed casualties. Geological anomalies aligned with described battle locations. The Titanomachy might have been myth, but it was myth built on foundation of historical catastrophe that left physical evidence. The future held more mysteries than answers. Would new pantheons arise following the same patterns? Would humanity itself replay the Titanomachy as technology made humans godlike? Would artificial intelligences overthrow their creators in silicon repetition of divine patricide? The war's pattern seemed inescapable, written into structure of power itself, ensuring that every generation would overthrow the previous, that every authority would breed its own destruction. The final mystery was whether the cycle could be broken. Kratos had tried by traveling to new lands, changing his nature, teaching his son differently. But his very presence triggered Norse mythology's acceleration toward its apocalypse. Perhaps the pattern was not curse, but nature, not flaw but feature, creative destruction, being the only way existence renewed itself. The Titanomachy had not been mistake, but mechanism, the cosmos's method of preventing stagnation through periodic catastrophic renewal. As this tale of the bloodiest war in mythology concludes, remember that conclusion itself was illusion. The war never ended, but only transformed, spreading through stories and patterns and unconscious imitation until every conflict carried its echo. When you see powerful fathers suspicious of strong son, you see Kronos. When you witness paranoid authority creating its own enemies, you see Zeus. When you observe violence justified as liberation, you see the Titanomachy continuing its eternal performance. The greatest revelation was that we are all still fighting the Titanomachy in countless small ways, replaying its patterns in our families, our politics, our personal struggles for power and meaning. The war between Titans and Olympians was not ancient history, but current event, not their story, but ours, not ended, but paused, waiting for the next generation to discover that overthrowing the old order only means becoming it, that victory and defeat are the same result seen from different angles, and that the bloodiest war in mythology was not the one that happened, but the one that never stops happening.